It began with a city that looked like the aftermath of an earthquake made of fire. Cologne didn't just sit in ruins, it breathed them. Smoke curled from hollowed buildings like sighs from a dying giant. The cathedral rose above it all, dark and wounded, standing in defiance against a skyline splintered into steel bones and broken brick. The streets were so shattered they barely resembled streets at all, more like veins of a fallen creature that once pulsed with life. And moving through this wrecked world were the last defenders, shadows slipping between craters and collapsed walls, knowing the storm approaching from the west would decide not just the city's fate, but the fate of everyone still clinging to it. By 1945, the city was a shadow of itself. Whole districts lay in ruins, roofs collapsed inward like broken ribs. Smoke drifted endlessly from smouldering timbers. Rubble spilled across roads once meant for laughter and commerce. And yet people still moved through it. Civilians who had lost homes, routines, and whole chapters of their lives, but refused to surrender their humanity. They carried water in buckets. They swept dust from the steps of what remained. They whispered to one another that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was reaching its end. But the war had not finished with Cologne. American forces approached from the west, advancing through towns that had already fallen silent. They followed roads lined with shattered trees, snowmelt pooling in craters where artillery had torn the earth open. They pushed through villages where windows hung shattered like broken teeth. The closer they drew to Cologne, the more the air changed. It grew thicker, heavier, saturated with the feeling that something enormous was waiting ahead, not a surprise, not an ambush, but a confrontation with history itself. Cologne was not just another objective. It was a symbol, a crossroads of culture, faith, and memory. A city that had seen empires rise and fall long before the war machines arrived. And the Germans knew it. They transformed the ruins into fortresses. Snipers took positions in hollowed-out attics. Machine gun crews hid behind collapsed walls. Tank destroyers rolled through the city's cracked streets like predators searching for the last scraps of safety. Every intersection became a killing field. Every surviving building became a shield. The Americans pressed on anyway. Street fighting in Cologne was unlike anything they had faced. The city swallowed sound. Gunfire echoed through narrow lanes, bouncing off stone and steel until it was impossible to tell where danger came from. Tanks advanced slowly, feeling their way forward through rubble that hid more than just debris. Infantry moved house to house, smashing through walls because doors had become invites to death. Smoke hung low in the air, mixing with dust until the sky itself seemed bruised. And then, in the middle of this shattered world, came one of the war's most haunting moments, a duel in the heart of the city. An American tank facing a German Panther at close range, their battle captured by a cameraman who risked everything to show the world what war looked like when it stripped away its myths. The footage became iconic, not because it glorified the fight, but because it revealed the quiet terror of two crews locked in a moment neither could escape. Cologne did not fall easily. It fell slowly, painfully, piece by piece. But eventually, the resistance cracked. German units withdrew or surrendered. Civilians emerged from cellars like ghosts returning to life. And for the first time in years, the air above Cologne felt like it might belong to the living again, even though the city around them lay broken, like a memory dropped from too high a place. Tonight, we return to that moment, to the ruins, the rubble, the cathedral standing defiantly over a city torn apart, to the footsteps of soldiers who walked through, streets where history and destruction lived side by side, to the people who survived long enough to see the war pull back its shadow inch by inch. Before we move deeper into this story, I want to ask you something in your own words. Something simple but human. Where are you listening from tonight, and what kind of place are you in right now? Cozy? Quiet? Somewhere that feels safe? And something else softer, more personal? As you listen, is there someone you're thinking of? Someone from your life, your past, your family, anyone whose memory drifts in the background of nights like this? You don't have to explain why. Just say their name if you want to. And one last invitation, unique to this documentary. Think about the last time something in your life fell apart. Not dramatically, just quietly, and you had to rebuild from the pieces. If you feel comfortable, tell me what that moment taught you. Not the pain, but the lesson that stayed behind. And if these long, gentle journeys into the past help you unwind, help you breathe, or help you drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. The Gothic spires of Cologne Cathedral pierced the summer sky on a bright June morning in 1939, their limestone towers reaching 515 feet above the Rhine River. The medieval structure dominates a bustling metropolis of 768,000 souls, Germany's fourth largest city, where trams clatter through cobblestone streets and merchants arrange fruit beneath striped awnings in the Neumarkt Square. Children chase each other around the fountain while their mothers shop, while overhead, invisible to the eye, but present nonetheless, something new has entered German airspace. A single British aircraft, flying at 25,000 feet, is photographing everything. This is not yet a city at war, though war has already been declared 9 months prior. Cologne, in the summer of 1940, exists in a strange twilight, celebrating distant victories in France while remaining untouched by the conflict that has consumed Europe. The Ford Work automobile plant on the city's western edge churns out civilian cars alongside military trucks. The Humboldt-Deutz factory produces farm tractors and tank engines in the same workshops. 7 major railway marshalling yards funnel goods across the Reich, their tracks converging on the Hohenzollern Bridge, an iron lattice spanning the Rhine like a mechanical cathedral of its own. To the city's residents, these are simply the industries that provide employment, the infrastructure of normal life. To the Royal Air Force officers examining reconnaissance photographs in London, they represent something else entirely: targets. The transformation of Cologne from cathedral city to target occurred gradually. Then suddenly, in May of 1940, as German tanks rolled through Belgium and France, the RAF conducted its first raid on German soil. A tentative mission that sent 12 Whitley bombers toward Cologne's industrial districts. The crews flew at night, navigating by dead reckoning in the stars, searching for landmarks in the darkness below. Most never found their intended targets. Bombs fell randomly across farmland and suburbs, killing 3 civilians and damaging a handful of buildings. The raid achieved nothing militarily but everything symbolically. Britain had demonstrated its willingness to strike back, and Cologne had been selected as the demonstration target. The city's fate was sealed that night, though few recognized it. By December of 1940, Cologne appeared in RAF target folders marked Priority A Industrial Target, a designation reserved for cities whose destruction would significantly impact Germany's war production. Air Marshal Charles Portal, commander of Bomber Command, examined these folders with growing frustration. The intelligence was excellent. Detailed reconnaissance photographs showed every factory, every rail yard, every bridge, but intelligence without the ability to act upon it was merely academic knowledge. Portal's bombers couldn't hit what they couldn't find, and in the darkness over Germany, they couldn't find anything. Cologne had been raided 35 times by the end of 1941, a statistic that sounded impressive until one examined the results. 485 civilians killed, 2% of industrial capacity destroyed, and a growing certainty among German civil defense officials that British bombing was more nuisance than threat. The city's defenders prepared according to what they had experienced, not what was possible. Gauleiter Josef Grohe, the Nazi Party official responsible for Cologne's civil defense, ordered the construction of public air raid shelters with capacity for 60,000 people, a number that seemed generous given that most RAF raids involved 20 to 30 aircraft at most. The city's anti-aircraft defences grew steadily. 54 heavy flak batteries equipped with 88mm guns, 36 light batteries with 20mm and 37mm weapons, and 282 searchlights positioned to create cones of light that would illuminate British bombers for the gunners. These defences had proven effective against small raids, shooting down enough RAF aircraft to make the British pay for every bomb that fell on Cologne. What they had not been tested against, what no German city had faced, was concentration. The residents of Cologne adapted to war with resignation rather than fear. Anna Krohn, a 34-year-old factory worker, kept a packed suitcase by her apartment door, a routine established after the first raids in 1940. Inside, identification papers, photographs, a change of clothes for herself and her 2 children, a small amount of cash. When the sirens wailed, and they wailed frequently, she would grab the suitcase, gather her children, and descend to the basement shelter her building shared with 3 others. The all clear would sound within an hour or two. Damage, if any, would be elsewhere in the city. Life would continue. This pattern had repeated itself dozens of times across 2 years, creating a false certainty that this was what air raids meant: temporary disruption, scattered damage, survival. The idea that an air raid could simply erase entire neighborhoods, could kill hundreds in minutes, could transform a city overnight, had not yet entered German civilian consciousness. That education was coming. The strategic importance of Cologne lay not in any single factory or bridge, but in its position as a nerve centre of Western German industry and transportation. The city sat at the junction where the Rhine River turned north toward the Netherlands, making it a natural transshipment point for goods moving between the Ruhr industrial region and the rest of Germany. Raw materials flowed south through Cologne toward the factories of southern Germany. Finished products flowed north and west. Destroy Cologne's rail infrastructure, British strategists reasoned, and you sever arteries feeding Germany's war machine. Destroy its factories, and you eliminate production capacity. Destroy its housing, and you de-house the workers who operate the factories, a coldly bureaucratic term for making people homeless that entered British military vocabulary in 1942. Cologne possessed all the attributes that made a city strategically valuable in the era of strategic bombing: industry, transportation infrastructure, dense urban housing, and distance from Britain that was long enough to challenge bomber crews but short enough to be feasible with existing aircraft. What Cologne also possessed, by accident of medieval construction, was the most recognisable landmark in Western Germany. The cathedral's twin spires could be seen from 30 miles away on a clear day, their distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in aerial photographs. For RAF bomber crews attempting to navigate by visual landmarks in the darkness, the cathedral represented the most reliable reference point between the Dutch coast and the Rhine. Find the cathedral, find the river, find Cologne. British target maps marked it prominently, not as a target itself, but as the geographic anchor point from which bomb aimers would calculate their release points. The supreme irony of Cologne, apparent to everyone who witnessed what would come, was that a Gothic cathedral built to glorify God in the 13th century would serve as the aiming point for the destruction of the city that surrounded it 600 years later. Faith and fire, medieval craftsmanship, and modern warfare, all converging on the same coordinates. The distance from British bomber bases to Cologne measured 350 miles as the crow flies, a figure that defined the boundaries of what was possible in 1941, early 1942. The RAF's heaviest bombers, the new 4-engine Stirlings and Halifaxes, could carry 4 tons of bombs to Cologne and return with minimal fuel reserves. The older twin-engine Wellingtons, which formed the bulk of Bomber Command's strength, could carry 3,000 pounds to the same distance. These payload-to-range calculations determined everything: how much destruction could theoretically be delivered, how many aircraft would be required to deliver it, how many raids would be necessary to achieve meaningful damage. British operations research analysts filled notebooks with such calculations, building mathematical models of urban destruction that treated cities as problems in geometry and tonnage. The human dimension, the reality that 768,000 individual lives continued beneath the bombing heights they calculated, appeared in their equations only as abstract variables labelled population density and housing units. By the spring of 1942, Cologne existed in 3 different versions simultaneously. The first version was the actual city, ancient and modern layers intertwined, a place where medieval churches stood beside modernist department stores, where layers of Roman ruins lay beneath the streets, where 750,000 people pursued the ordinary business of living, despite a war that seemed, from their perspective, to be happening elsewhere. The second version existed in RAF headquarters at High Wycombe, England, where Cologne appeared as target photographs, bomb damage assessments, lists of factories and rail yards, and frustrated notations about previous raids' failures to inflict significant damage. The third version existed in the mind of Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who would assume command of Bomber Command in February of 1942, a man who looked at Cologne and saw not a city but a test case, a hypothesis, a question that could only be answered with maximum force applied, with maximum concentration. These 3 versions of Cologne, the lived city, the target city, and the theoretical city, would collide on a single night in May. The collision would change everything. The photograph arrived on David Benson Butt's desk in August of 1941, with no particular ceremony. One image among hundreds being analysed that week by the War Cabinet Secretariat. But a civil servant with no aviation background, but an Oxford education in statistics, had been assigned to answer a simple question: were RAF bombers actually hitting their targets? The question seemed almost insultingly basic, the kind of thing that should have been resolved in the first months of the war. But 18 months into the strategic bombing campaign, no one had systematically examined the evidence. What Butt discovered, working through 650 night raid photographs with mathematical rigour, would trigger a crisis that threatened Bomber Command's entire existence. The methodology was straightforward. RAF bombers carried cameras that photographed the ground. At the moment bombs were released, flash photography synchronised with bomb release to capture the target area. These photographs were supposed to prove the bombs had hit their intended targets, documentation for the official record and propaganda purposes, but examined photographs from 100 nights of operations, spanning June and July of 1941, cross-referencing them with crew reports claiming successful attacks. What emerged was a devastating gap between what crews claimed and what the cameras showed. Of all aircraft claiming to have attacked their primary targets, only 1 in 3 had released bombs within 5 miles of the aiming point. Over the heavily defended Ruhr industrial region, which included targets near Cologne, only 1 in 5 had managed even this modest accuracy. Over Germany as a whole, only 1 in 3 crews got within 5 miles of what they were trying to hit. 5 miles. The number landed in the War Cabinet like an artillery shell. 5 miles meant bombs intended for the Krupp armaments works in Essen were falling in farmland. 5 miles meant raids against Hamburg's port facilities were hitting suburbs or missing the city entirely. 5 miles meant that the strategic bombing campaign, Britain's primary offensive weapon against Nazi Germany, the operation consuming 25,000 aircrew and thousands of aircraft, was achieving approximately nothing. Air Marshal Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff, received the Butt report on August 18th and immediately grasped its implications. If the report's findings became public, Bomber Command might be disbanded entirely, its resources redirected to other services. The Royal Navy wanted aircraft for convoy protection, the Army wanted air support for ground operations. Only faith that strategic bombing would eventually prove decisive had protected Bomber Command's independence. That faith now rested on foundations of statistical quicksand. The nights of November 9th to 10th, 1941, demonstrated the crisis with brutal clarity. Bomber Command dispatched 392 aircraft against targets across Germany and occupied Europe, the largest single-night effort to date. Cologne was among the targets, assigned 37 Wellingtons and Hamptons tasked with bombing the city's railway facilities. The crews returned reporting successful attacks, confident claims of bombs on target, heavy explosions observed, fires started. The next morning, reconnaissance aircraft photographed Cologne from 28,000 feet, capturing the entire city in crisp detail. Photo interpreters at RAF Medmenham examined the images with magnifying glasses, searching for the damage the crews had reported. They found scattered bomb craters in suburbs and farmland, minor damage to a few residential streets, and the railway. Facilities completely untouched. 37 aircraft had dropped approximately 45 tons of bombs on Cologne that night. Perhaps 5 tons had fallen within the city boundaries. The rest had gone into the countryside, their impact measured in damaged vegetables and frightened cows. Portal confronted the reality in a meeting with Winston Churchill in late August of 1941, bringing the Butt report and reconnaissance photographs from recent raids. Churchill, who had championed strategic bombing as Britain's answer to the Wehrmacht's continental dominance, read through the statistics in silence. When he finally spoke, his words were measured but unmistakably sharp. This is simply not good enough. The Prime Minister was not terminating the bombing campaign. Too much had been invested, and Britain needed some way to strike back at Germany. But he was demanding results, actual destruction of German industry, not ineffectual gestures. Portal left the meeting with an impossible mandate: make strategic bombing work, and make it work soon, or face the dissolution of Bomber Command as an independent service. The technical challenges were immense and interconnected. Navigation over blacked-out enemy territory at night relied on dead reckoning, mathematical calculations of wind speed, compass heading, and airspeed that accumulated errors with every mile flown. A navigation error of 5 degrees, barely noticeable on a compass, translated to a 15-mile position error after flying 300 miles to Cologne. Winds aloft. impossible to measure accurately from a bomber's cockpit, could push aircraft dozens of miles off course without crews realizing it. Astronavigation using star sights worked in theory but required clear skies and several minutes of stable flight to take accurate measurements, conditions rarely available over defended German airspace. The result was that most RAF bombers arrived over Germany with only approximate knowledge of their position, trying to find specific factories in cities they couldn't reliably locate. Even if a crew somehow found their target city, identifying specific aiming points in darkness proved nearly impossible. British bombers operated at night to avoid German fighters, but night bombing meant relying on moonlight and whatever fires were already burning to illuminate targets. On moonless nights, or when cloud cover obscured the ground, bomb aimers peered through their sights, seeing nothing but darkness, guessing at release points based on dead reckoning position and elapsed time. The Cologne raids of 1940 and 41 followed this pattern repeatedly. Aircraft would reach the general area of Cologne, bomb aimers would search for the cathedral or river as landmarks, and in the absence of visual confirmation, crews would bomb when their navigator said they should be over the target. Whether they actually were over the target was essentially random chance. Some bombed the right city. Some bombed the wrong city. Some bombed nothing but countryside, their bombs creating craters that farmers would discover at dawn, evidence of a battle being fought in the dark by men who had no idea where they were. The human cost of this navigational futility mounted steadily. Bomber Command lost approximately 1,400 aircraft in 1941, aircraft that accomplished little except forcing Germany to station flak guns and fighters in the Reich's interior instead of at the fighting fronts. The exchange rate was catastrophic. 1,400 heavy bombers lost, each carrying 6 or 7 highly trained crew members, in return for scattered damage across German cities that Germany's war production barely noticed. Individual bomber crews understood their survival odds with grim clarity. A standard bomber tour of operations consisted of 30 missions. Statistical analysis showed that crews starting their tour had approximately a 44% chance of surviving all 30 missions. Most didn't survive. Most died in burning aircraft over Germany or in the North Sea during the return flight, or in crashes at their home airfields when battle-damaged aircraft attempted landings in the dark. The survivors would complete their tour and be rewarded with 6 months of training duties before being sent back for another tour, another 30 missions, another statistical coin flip with death. Lord Cherwell, Churchill's scientific advisor, proposed a radical solution in a memo dated March 30th, 1942. If RAF bombers couldn't hit specific factories, Cherwell argued, they should instead destroy the cities containing the factories. Not the industrial facilities themselves, but the housing where the workers lived. Dehousing workers would reduce production just as effectively as destroying factories, and had the advantage of being achievable with current navigational accuracy. A bomber crew that couldn't hit a specific factory could hit a city. A crew that couldn't identify a railway marshalling yard in darkness could drop incendiaries on residential districts and start fires that would accomplish the same strategic objective through a different mechanism. Cherwell's memo included calculations showing that destroying the 58 principal German cities would require 10,000 bombers dropping incendiaries and would render 25 million Germans homeless. The memo never used the word terror bombing, but the implication was unavoidable. Kill enough civilians, destroy enough homes, and Germany's war production would collapse. The Cherwell memo arrived at a moment of maximum British desperation. The Soviet Union was demanding a second front to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. The United States had entered the war but had not yet deployed significant forces to Europe. Britain needed to demonstrate it was seriously damaging. Germany needed to convince Stalin that the Western Allies were contributing to the war effort, needed to justify the resources being poured into Bomber Command. Strategic bombing was supposed to be Britain's answer to all these pressures, the way a nation with a powerful air force but relatively small army could still inflict decisive damage on Nazi Germany. But strategic bombing, as practiced in 1941 and early 1942, was achieving nothing worth the cost. Something had to change, either the targeting philosophy or the entire strategic approach. The man who would change it, who would transform Bomber Command from a technically incompetent force into an instrument of urban destruction, was about to assume command. His name was Arthur Harris, and he believed in maximum force applied without hesitation or moral doubt. The cathode ray tube glowed green in the darkness of the laboratory at Swanage on the Dorset coast, displaying a pattern of intersecting hyperbolic lines that represented the future of aerial navigation. Dr. Robert Dippy adjusted the controls, watching the lines sharpen on the screen, while a group of skeptical RAF officers observed from behind him in January of 1942. The device was called GEE, a name derived either from the word grid or simply from the letter G for grid, depending on which engineer told the story. What mattered was not the name, but what GEE promised: the ability to fix an aircraft's position over enemy territory to within 6 miles in any weather, day or night, without reference to visual landmarks. If GEE worked as advertised, it would solve Bomber Command's navigational crisis. If it didn't, thousands more bombers would continue dropping their loads into German farmland while crews confidently reported successful attacks. GEE functioned on principles of radio physics that most bomber crews would never fully understand, but the operational concept was elegant. 3 ground stations in England transmitted synchronized radio pulses at precisely timed intervals. An aircraft receiving these pulses could measure the tiny time differences between them, differences measured in microseconds. Each time difference corresponded to a specific hyperbolic line on a special navigation chart. Where 2 hyperbolic lines intersected, that point marked the aircraft's position. The navigator watched the pulses on a cathode screen, measured the time intervals, consulted his GEE chart, and announced the aircraft's position. No dead reckoning calculation required. No star sights needed. No searching for visual landmarks in the darkness. Pure electronic navigation, accurate to approximately 1 mile within a range of 350 miles from the transmitters, which conveniently placed Cologne at the edge of optimum GEE coverage. The first operational use of GEE over Cologne occurred on the night of March 8th to 9th, 1942, a modest raid by post-May standards, but revolutionary for what it demonstrated. 1. 111 aircraft carried experimental GEE equipment, their navigators trained in its use during the previous weeks. The mission planners selected a straightforward target in Cologne's industrial district, easily identifiable from the air, to test whether GEE-equipped aircraft showed improved accuracy compared to non-GEE aircraft bombing the same target. The results, analysed from reconnaissance photographs taken the next day, were unambiguous. Bombs from GEE-equipped aircraft clustered within a 2-mile radius of the aiming point. Bombs from aircraft navigating by traditional methods scattered across a 6-mile area, with many falling outside Cologne entirely. The technology worked. The question now was how quickly it could be deployed across Bomber Command before the Germans found a countermeasure. German signals intelligence detected GEE transmissions within days of its first operational use, an inevitability that British scientists had anticipated. Radio pulses travelling through the atmosphere don't respect national boundaries. They can be received by anyone with appropriate equipment. The Funkhorststelle, Germany's signals intelligence service, operated listening stations across occupied Europe, specifically to detect new British radio technologies. On March 10th, 1942, a listening station in the Netherlands reported unusual pulse transmissions on 1.5 MHz frequency, synchronized patterns that didn't match any known British communications or radar system. The intercepts were forwarded to General Wolfgang Martini, the Luftwaffe's signals chief, who immediately recognized their significance. The British had developed a navigation aid that used ground-based transmitters, which meant British bombers would no longer be navigationally blind over Germany. Martini's report to Hermann Goering and ultimately to Hitler in April of 1942 triggered 2 parallel German responses: technical analysis to understand GEEs, vulnerabilities, an urgent acceleration of jamming technology development. German engineers, working with intercepted GEE signals and eventually with actual GEE equipment recovered from crashed British bombers, determined that the system operated on fixed frequencies and could theoretically be jammed by transmitting noise on the same frequencies. But building effective jammers would take time measured in months. And during those months, the British would enjoy a crucial window of navigational superiority. The Germans estimated they could have operational jammers deployed by late summer or early autumn of 1942. British intelligence, aware through decrypted German signals that their GEE advantage was temporary, calculated they had approximately 6 to 8 months before jamming degraded GEE's effectiveness. Whatever the RAF intended to accomplish with GEE-enabled navigation needed to happen soon. The installation program proceeded with urgency that reflected GEE's strategic importance. By March of 1942, 200 bombers had been equipped with GEE sets. By June, over 1,000 aircraft carried the equipment, practically every operational bomber in Bomber Command, plus many in training units. Each GEE set cost approximately £400, expensive but trivial compared to the £60,000 cost of a Lancaster bomber. The sets were manufactured in secrecy, their internal components deliberately designed to be difficult to reverse engineer if captured. Crews received explicit instructions: if forced to bail out or crash land over enemy territory, destroy the GEE equipment before abandoning the aircraft. German recovery of intact GEE sets would accelerate their jamming program. Some crews followed these instructions. Others, in the chaos of aircraft disintegrating around them or burning on impact, had neither time nor ability to destroy equipment before escaping. The Germans acquired intact GEE sets by mid-March, but the information gained only confirmed what they already knew from signal intercepts. Understanding GEE and negating GEE were separate challenges, and the second would take longer. GEE's technical specifications revealed both its power and its limitations in ways that would directly influence what became possible on the night of May 30th to 31st. The system's accuracy degraded with distance from the transmitter chain, a function of the radio pulse geometry. Within 200 miles of the British coast, GEE provided position accuracy of approximately 1 mile. At Cologne's distance of 275 miles, accuracy degraded to about 6 miles in ideal conditions. Beyond 350 miles, the signals became too weak or the geometric baseline too narrow for reliable fixes. This meant cities in eastern Germany, places like Berlin or Dresden, lay beyond GEE's effective range. But Cologne, Hamburg, and the Ruhr industrial cities fell within the coverage zone. The accuracy limitation also meant that GEE couldn't guide bombers to specific buildings or even specific factories within a city, but it could reliably guide them to the city itself, a capability that aligned perfectly with the area bombing philosophy that Cherwell had advocated and that Air Marshal Harris was about to implement. The electronic warfare dimension introduced a temporal urgency that would shape operational planning in the spring of 1942. Every raid using GEE was also training German signals intelligence in how to track GEE-equipped bomber streams, giving them data to refine their jamming techniques. Every week that passed brought German jammers closer to deployment. British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment worked on countermeasures, ways to modify GEE to resist jamming, but this was a race with no finish line. Every advance would be met with a counter-advance. Every technology would eventually be obsoleted by a superior technology. The only certainty was that GEE's period of unchallenged effectiveness was finite and diminishing. If Bomber Command intended to use GEE to deliver a demonstration of strategic bombing's potential, a raid so large and so destructive that it would validate the entire bombing strategy, that demonstration needed to happen soon before the Germans closed the technological window. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, assuming command of Bomber Command in late February of 1942, understood the opportunity with immediate clarity. GEE gave him the navigation tool he needed. The growing bomber force gave him the numbers. The political pressure from Churchill and the War Cabinet gave him the mandate, but the German jammers gave him a deadline. Harris began planning an operation unlike anything yet attempted in the air war, a raid of such overwhelming scale that it would achieve in one night what 2 years of scattered attacks had failed to accomplish. The target would need to be within GEE range, would need to be strategically significant enough to justify the effort, and would need to be achievable with the forces available. Cologne met all these criteria. The city's fate was approaching with the inexorability of geometry and radio physics, a convergence of technology, strategy, and timing that neither Cologne's defenders nor its residents could yet perceive. The machine was solving the problem of how to destroy a city, and the solution was being written in hyperbolic curves on GEE navigation charts. Arthur Travis Harris walked into the Commander-in-Chief's office at RAF High Wycombe on February 22, 1942, carrying a reputation for ruthlessness that preceded him like weather. At 49 years old, he had served in the Royal Flying Corps since 1914, commanded squadrons in multiple theatres, and developed a philosophy of air power that admitted no room for half measures. His subordinates called him Butch, a nickname from his earlier service. though few used it to his face. The press would later call him Bomber Harris, a title he wore without apparent discomfort. What mattered to Harris was not how he was perceived, but whether his aircraft were destroying German cities, and when he assumed command of Bomber Command, they were not. Harris's first staff meeting on February 25th established the tone for everything that followed. He addressed his assembled group commanders and staff officers with characteristic bluntness. There are a lot of people who say that bombing cannot win the war. My reply to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. The statement was both promise and threat. Promise to the crews who would fly the missions. Threat to anyone who doubted strategic bombing's potential. Harris had examined the Butt report, understood the navigational crisis, knew that Bomber Command had accomplished little in 2 years of operations. But where others saw failure requiring strategic rethinking, Harris saw inadequate force requiring escalation. The problem wasn't that strategic bombing didn't work. The problem was that Britain hadn't dropped enough bombs on enough cities with enough concentration to make it work. That was about to change. The political context of early 1942 demanded dramatic demonstrations of British offensive capability. Soviet armies were containing German forces on the Eastern Front but taking catastrophic casualties, losing hundreds of thousands of men monthly. Stalin's demands for a second front, an Anglo-American invasion of occupied Europe to relieve pressure on the USSR, grew increasingly strident. Churchill needed to demonstrate to Stalin that Britain was seriously damaging Germany even without launching ground operations. The Americans, newly entered into the war, advocated daylight precision bombing of specific industrial targets, an approach Harris regarded as suicidal, given German fighter defences. British bombing doctrine needed to prove itself before American skepticism hardened into policy. Bomber Command required a success, unmistakable and undeniable, to silence critics in Parliament, in other services, and in Allied governments. Harris and Churchill met at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, in March of 1942, to discuss how to achieve this necessary demonstration. Churchill had championed strategic bombing since 1940 as Britain's only way to strike directly at Germany, but the Butt report had shaken his confidence. He needed Harris to prove that the resources being poured into Bomber Command, the 25,000 aircrew, the thousands of aircraft, the industrial capacity devoted to bomber production, were yielding results commensurate with the investment. Harris arrived with a proposal sketched in broad strokes. 1,000 bombers over one German city in one night. The number was chosen for psychological impact. As much as military necessity, 1,000 aircraft represented a scale of attack unprecedented in warfare, a number large enough to capture headlines and imaginations, large enough to overwhelm any city's defences, large enough to validate strategic bombing theory through sheer overwhelming force. Churchill grasped both the operational audacity and political utility of Harris's proposal immediately. A 1,000-bomber raid would demonstrate British resolve to Stalin, would impress the Americans, would boost British civilian morale after years of defensive fighting, and would terrify Germans who had largely escaped the direct consequences of the war they had started. But Churchill also understood the risks. If the raid failed, if weather forced cancellation, if losses were catastrophic, if reconnaissance photographs showed minimal damage, the entire strategic bombing program might be terminated. Harris was proposing to gamble Bomber Command's future on a single night's operations. The Prime Minister authorised planning to proceed, but made clear that final approval would depend on Harris's ability to actually assemble 1,000 bombers, a requirement that seemed impossible given that Bomber Command's operational strength in March of 1942 stood at only 378 heavy bombers. Harris returned to High Wycombe and summoned his planning staff to solve the seemingly impossible arithmetic. 378 operational bombers fell far short of 1,000. But what if they stripped aircraft from training units? What if they borrowed aircraft from Coastal Command? What if they included obsolete types normally relegated to training duties? What if they accepted lower crew experience levels, mixing veteran crews with instructors and even advanced students? The plan that emerged was unprecedented and desperate. Bomber Command would mobilise every aircraft it could make airworthy, regardless of type or unit assignment, crew them with anyone qualified to fly, and send them all to a single target in a single night. The operation would temporarily cripple Bomber Command's training infrastructure, leave Coastal Command unable to fully protect Atlantic convoys, and expose partially trained crews to combat, for which they had limited preparation. but it would produce 1,000 aircraft, and 1,000 aircraft bombing one city would be impossible to ignore. The target selection process began in mid-April, with Harris and his staff examining folders for potential cities. Hamburg offered excellent industrial targets but sat at the extreme edge of GEE range, making navigation marginal. Essen contained the Krupp armaments works, perhaps the single most valuable target in Germany, but was notoriously difficult to find even with GEE due to industrial haze and lack of distinctive landmarks. Berlin was too distant for heavily loaded bombers to reach and return safely. Cologne emerged as the optimal choice for reasons both technical and strategic. The Cathedral provided an unmistakable visual landmark. The city fell well within GEE coverage. The Rhine River offered another navigation reference. Cologne's defences were formidable but not insurmountable, and critically, Cologne was close enough to British bases that even obsolete aircraft and partially trained crews could reach it. Harris's memo to Air Marshal Charles Portal on May 17th outlined Operation Millennium in crisp, bureaucratic language that barely concealed the plan's audacity. 1,000 bombers would attack Cologne on the first night when weather forecasts showed clear skies over the target. The raid would be concentrated into 90 minutes, creating a bomber stream of unprecedented density. Waves of aircraft would arrive in precisely timed sequence, each wave bombing the fires started by the previous wave. The combined weight of attack, Harris predicted, would overwhelm Cologne's fire services, destroy thousands of buildings, kill hundreds or thousands of civilians, and demonstrate beyond doubt that strategic bombing could devastate German cities. Portal approved the plan on May 19th with a single condition. Harris had to actually find 1,000 aircraft. The Commander-in-Chief returned to High Wycombe and began the process of scraping together an air fleet from units that had never been intended to operate together, led by crews ranging from combat veterans to students barely qualified to fly at night. What could possibly go wrong? The philosophical foundation beneath Harris's planning was a view of warfare stripped of sentimentality or moral hesitation. Germany had initiated the war, had bombed Warsaw and Rotterdam, and London had demonstrated total disregard for civilian populations when doing so served military objectives. Harris felt no obligation to fight by more restrictive rules than those Germany had established. If bombing German workers' housing contributed to winning the war, then housing would be bombed. If creating firestorms that killed indiscriminately served strategic purposes, then firestorms would be created. Harris's personal writings reveal no evidence of sadistic pleasure in civilian casualties, but neither do they show any indication that civilian casualties troubled him. He viewed strategic bombing as a grim mathematical problem. Determine the tonnage of explosives required to destroy German industrial capacity, calculate the number of raids needed to deliver that tonnage, execute those raids until the job was complete. The fact that solving this mathematical problem required burning cities and killing civilians was regrettable but unavoidable. The price of defeating Nazi Germany and ending a war Germany had started. The appointment of Arthur Harris to command Bomber Command in February 1942 thus represented both continuity and transformation. Continuity because Harris embraced the area bombing doctrine that Cherwell had outlined and that Portal had already accepted as necessary given navigation limitations. Transformation because Harris brought operational ruthlessness and propaganda instincts that turned area bombing from desperate expedient into calculated strategy. Previous Bomber Command leaders had stumbled into bombing cities because they couldn't find specific factories. Harris would bomb cities because bombing cities was the most efficient use of available bomber technology to inflict maximum damage on German war-making capacity. The 1,000-bomber raid was not a deviation from this strategy, but its ultimate expression. Maximum force, minimum doubt, overwhelming concentration. Cologne would be the test case that proved strategic bombing's viability or exposed its futility. Either way, Harris intended to remove all ambiguity from the result. The target selection meeting convened at RAF High Wycombe on May 24, 1942, with the most critical variable still unknown: weather. Air Marshal Harris's staff had assembled target folders for 3 potential cities: Hamburg, Essen, and Cologne, each offering different advantages and challenges. But weather would make the final decision, because Operation Millennium's entire premise required visual bombing conditions over the target. Cloud cover obscuring the city would scatter bombs uselessly across the countryside, rendering the massive effort pointless. The meteorological forecast for May 30th to 31st would determine where 1,000 bombers flew and which German city would experience industrial warfare at a scale previously unimagined. Hamburg presented the most attractive strategic target, Germany's second-largest city and most important port. Hamburg's destruction would cripple U-boat construction, naval facilities, and maritime trade essential to the Reich's war economy. The city's position on the Elbe River provided good navigation references and reconnaissance. Photographs showed concentrated industrial districts, ideal for area bombing. But Hamburg's distance from British bases, 350 miles, placed it at the absolute limit of GEE coverage. Navigation accuracy would be marginal at that range, and fuel reserves would be minimal for returning aircraft. More critically, the weather forecast for Hamburg on May 30th showed probable cloud cover, 10/10 coverage predicted, which would make visual bombing impossible. Hamburg was eliminated not for strategic reasons, but because the atmosphere refused to cooperate. Essen offered a target of supreme industrial importance, the Krupp Armaments Works, one of Germany's primary weapons manufacturers. A sprawling complex of factories producing everything from tank armour to artillery shells. Destroying Krupp would directly impact German fighting capacity on multiple fronts. But Essen possessed a characteristic that had frustrated RAF raid planners since the war began. It was almost impossible to find. The city sat in the heart of the Ruhr industrial region, surrounded by dozens of other industrial cities whose blacked-out profiles were indistinguishable from each other at night. The Ruhr's constant industrial haze obscured landmarks even in daylight. GEE could get bombers to the general area, but identifying Essen specifically from 10,000 feet in darkness required visual landmarks that simply didn't exist. Previous raids on Essen had demonstrated this problem repeatedly, with bombs scattering across the Ruhr region as crews bombed whatever city they thought was Essen. The 1,000-bomber raid needed concentrated impact, which required accurate target identification. Essen couldn't provide it. Cologne emerged as the optimal target through a process of elimination shaped by meteorology, geography, and technical constraints. The weather forecast for Cologne on May 30th to 31st predicted clear skies, an anticyclone moving across western Germany. Promising good visibility, the forecast proved decisive. Cologne also offered every technical advantage a raid planner could want. Distance from British bases measured 275 miles, comfortably within GEE range, with accuracy of approximately 1 to 2 miles. The Rhine River provided an unmistakable visual landmark, a wide dark ribbon easily visible even in moonlight. The cathedral's twin spires, 515 feet tall, created a silhouette recognizable from 30 miles away on a clear night. The city itself sprawled across both sides of the Rhine, a large compact target where even bombs falling off aim would still hit urban districts. Navigation to Cologne was as straightforward as navigation over blacked-out Germany could be. Cross the North Sea, make landfall on the Dutch coast, turn southeast, follow the Rhine, arrive at Cologne. Crews who had never flown combat before could accomplish this with GEE guidance. The defensive assessment tempered. Optimism with realism. Cologne was not undefended. Intelligence estimates counted 54 heavy flak batteries equipped with 88mm guns, weapons capable of reaching 26,000 feet and deadly accurate when directed by radar fire control. 36 light flak batteries with 20mm and 37mm guns covered lower altitudes. 282 searchlights would illuminate the night sky, attempting to cone bombers in multiple beams that would both blind crews and mark targets for gunners. Night fighter bases in the Netherlands could scramble Messerschmitt 1-10 fighters to intercept bomber streams. Gauleiter Josef Grohe, the Nazi official responsible for Cologne's civil defense, commanded an organization that had battled through more than 100 RAF raids since 1940. These defenders were experienced, equipped, and motivated. They had successfully protected Cologne against everything the RAF had thrown at the city for 2 years. But they had never faced 1,000 bombers in 90 minutes, had never experienced the bomber stream concept, had never been tested against concentration rather than dispersion. The moon phase added another variable to the calculation. May 30th to 31st would feature a waning gibbous moon, 83% illumination, providing substantial light for visual navigation and target identification. Moonlight helped bomber crews see landmarks and bomb aimers identify aiming points, but it also helped German night fighters see British bombers. The balance tilted in favour of the attackers for a specific reason. Bomber crews needed moonlight for only 90 minutes over Cologne, while night fighters needed to find individual bombers scattered across hundreds of miles of sky. The moon would illuminate the target better than it illuminated individual targets. Additionally, the sheer number of aircraft would overwhelm the available night fighters. If 50 night fighters were airborne, impossibly optimistic for German scramble rates, they would face 1,000 bombers, a ratio that made systematic interception impossible. The Germans would shoot down some aircraft, perhaps many aircraft, but they couldn't stop the raid. Harris made the final decision on May 26th after reviewing updated weather forecasts. Hamburg was scrubbed due to predicted cloud cover. Essen was too difficult to identify reliably. Cologne offered clear skies, good visibility, manageable defences, and ideal navigation conditions. Cologne it is, Harris announced to his staff. Maximum effort, May 30th. The order went out to every bomber command station, every training unit, every borrowed coastal command squadron. Prepare all serviceable aircraft for operations on the night of May 30th to 31st. Target to be announced at briefing. Estimated force 1,000 plus aircraft. Estimated duration over target 90 minutes. Estimated casualties. Classified. But planners privately calculated a 5% loss rate as optimistic, which meant 50 aircraft would not return. 50 aircraft times 7 crew members per aircraft meant 350 men dead or captured. This was the price of demonstrating strategic bombing's potential, and Harris was willing to pay it. The selection of Cologne carried consequences that extended beyond that single city's fate. By choosing Cologne, Harris established a template for future raids. Cities would be selected based on weather, navigation, convenience, and defensibility, as much as strategic importance. The cities that suffered most severely in the strategic bombing campaign would be those that sat within GEE range, possessed visual landmarks for identification, and happened to have clear skies when Harris wanted to launch major raids. Strategic importance would justify raids, but technical convenience would determine which cities actually got bombed and when. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, and dozens of other cities would learn this lesson in subsequent years. Cologne was simply the first city where the new calculus of urban destruction would be applied. What the residents of Cologne could not know on May 26th was that their city had been selected not because it was the most important target in Germany, but because the weather forecast looked favourable and their cathedral made navigation easy. Strategic bombing in practice operated according to logistical convenience as much as strategic planning. The result was the same, bombs falling and cities burning, but the process revealed something fundamental about industrial warfare. The machinery often determined the targets as much as the strategy did. GEE's range determined which cities could be reliably found. Weather forecasts determined which cities would be bombed on any given night. The cathedral that Cologne had built to glorify God in the 13th century now marked Cologne for destruction in the 20th, a navigation beacon guiding bombers to the city's industrial districts and residential neighbourhoods. Divine providence or historical irony, the result was identical. Cologne would burn because the sky above it was predicted to be clear. The signal went out from RAF High Wycombe at 1400 hours on May 26th, 1942, a terse message that arrived at 53 airfields across England, with the force of a mobilisation order. All bomber command stations will report maximum serviceable aircraft for operations night May 30th to 31st. Station commanders read the message with mixture of confusion and alarm. Maximum serviceable didn't mean the aircraft currently on operational status. It meant every aircraft that could theoretically be made flyable, including those undergoing maintenance, those with minor damage, those relegated to training duties, those being test flown after engine changes. The order was asking for the impossible, and it was not phrased as a request. RAF Cranwell, home to Bomber Training Command, received notification that fundamentally altered the school's mission within hours. Instructors who had been teaching navigation, bombing techniques, and tactical procedures to student crews were informed they would be flying combat operations in 4 days. These were not young pilots on their first tours. Many instructor pilots had accumulated thousands of flight hours and had completed combat tours before being assigned to training duties. But their students, the navigators and bomb aimers and wireless operators being trained for eventual combat deployment, were now being told that eventual meant May 30th. Classes scheduled for that week were cancelled. Aircraft normally used for training circuits and navigation exercises were being loaded with bombs. The training pipeline that fed Bomber Command with qualified crews was being shut down and its resources cannibalized for a single night's operation, a decision that would have consequences for months afterward. The maintenance crews at operational stations received the order with weary resignation and immediate action. At RAF Waddington, home to 44 Squadrons Lancasters, engineering officers surveyed the aircraft status boards and began calculations. 19 Lancasters were operationally serviceable, meaning they could fly tonight if ordered. 3 more were undergoing routine maintenance, engines being changed or control surfaces being adjusted, work that would normally take a week. Those 3 aircraft had 4 days to become flyable. 2 Lancasters sat in the hangar with battle damage from previous raids, one with flak damage to a wing, another with an engine that had failed and been shut down during a raid on Essen. Those aircraft had been written off as requiring weeks of repair work. Now they had 4 days. Maintenance crews began working in shifts around the clock, stripping parts from aircraft too damaged to repair, cannibalizing components from training aircraft, improvising solutions to problems that normally required factory-manufactured replacement parts. The lobbying effort to obtain aircraft from other commands revealed the inter-service tensions that Harris's plan aggravated. Coastal Command operated dozens of aircraft types suitable for bombing, particularly long-range aircraft like Wellingtons and Whitleys used for maritime patrol and anti-submarine operations. Harris requested 250 Coastal Command aircraft be temporarily assigned to Operation Millennium. The Admiralty exploded in protest. Coastal Command's maritime patrol aircraft were protecting Atlantic convoys against U-boat attacks, hunting submarines that were sinking merchant ships carrying food and supplies to Britain. Removing those aircraft for even a single night would create gaps in convoy coverage that U-boats could exploit. Harris's counter-argument was blunt. Strategic. Bombing would help win the war, and 1,000 bombers over Cologne would contribute more to final victory than one night of additional convoy patrols. The argument went to the War Cabinet, which ruled in Harris's favour. Coastal Command would contribute aircraft. The Atlantic convoys would accept increased risk for one night. The Admiralty complied while making clear its view that Bomber Command was prioritising its own propaganda requirements over operational necessities. The final tally came together piecemeal over 4 days of frantic organisation. Bomber Command's operational squadrons contributed 602 heavy bombers, the core force of Wellingtons, Halifaxes, Stirlings, and the new Lancasters. Training units provided 367 aircraft crewed by instructor pilots and advanced students, a force nearly as large as the operational strength. Coastal Command, under protest, assigned 45 aircraft. Flying Training Command scraped together 28 aircraft from training schools, miscellaneous units, test facilities, and conversion schools contributed the final handful. On May 29th at 2300 hours, the final count was reported to 1,047 aircraft. He had his 1,000. He had exceeded it. The number included practically every bomber in Britain that could fly, regardless of its condition or the experience level of its crew. The aircraft types mobilised for Operation Millennium read like a museum collection of RAF bomber development. The backbone was 338 Vickers Wellingtons, twin-engine aircraft that had formed Bomber Command's strength since 1939, reliable but increasingly obsolete. 131 Handley Page Halifaxes and 88 Short Stirlings represented the new generation of 4-engine heavy bombers, capable of carrying 4-ton bomb loads to Cologne. 73 Avro Lancasters, the most advanced bomber in service, would fly their largest mission to date. But the force also included 79 Handley Page Hamptons, twin-engine medium bombers already considered obsolete, relegated to training units but pressed back into combat for this one night. 46 Avro Manchesters, troubled aircraft with unreliable engines that had led to the type being withdrawn from operations, were scraped together from training units and storage. Even a handful of obsolete types like Whitleys flew aircraft so outdated they were normally used only for training parachute jumpers. This was not a carefully integrated bomber force. This was everything that could fly being sent to the same target, in hope that sheer numbers would overwhelm any deficiency in quality. The crew experience levels varied to an almost absurd degree, creating a bomber stream where some aircraft were flown by pilots on their 50th combat operation, while the aircraft next to them carried a pilot on his first training unit. Instructors averaged over 3,000 flight hours each, veterans of previous bombing campaigns who had survived their combat tours and been rewarded with teaching duties. Their students averaged 300 flight hours, barely enough to qualify for operational duty under normal circumstances. Some student navigators had never navigated over enemy territory. Some bomb aimers had never released bombs in combat. Some wireless operators had never transmitted while being shot at. These crews were being sent to attack the most heavily defended city in Western Germany in company with 1,000 other aircraft attempting to bomb the same target simultaneously, a scenario that would challenge even experienced crews. The loss rate among training unit crews would be predictably higher than among operational squadrons, a fact that planning staff acknowledged in their casualty estimates but accepted as necessary cost. The serviceability achievement was remarkable and frankly unsustainable. Normal bomber command serviceability rates ran about 55%, meaning that of 100 aircraft on strength, 55 would be flyable on any given night. For Operation Millennium, maintenance crews achieved 73% serviceability by working 48-hour shifts, by accepting maintenance shortcuts that would never be permitted under normal circumstances, by declaring aircraft operational that under standard criteria would require another week of work. Engines that should have been changed were run for one more mission. Control surfaces with minor damage were patched instead of replaced. Aircraft that should have been grounded for thorough inspections were signed off as combat ready. This was organised desperation disguised as operational necessity, a one-time surge that couldn't be sustained for repeated operations. If Operation Millennium was cancelled due to weather, or if it needed to be repeated a few days later, the maintenance organisation couldn't deliver 1,000 aircraft again. This was a single-use capability being mobilised for a single night's demonstration. The political risk Harris accepted by mobilising training units would become apparent only in subsequent months. Bomber Command's expansion plans required a steady flow of trained crews from training schools to operational squadrons. By pulling 367 aircraft and their instructor crews out of training for Operation Millennium, Harris was interrupting that flow for approximately 6 weeks. Training couldn't continue without instructors or aircraft. Students who should have been graduating in June would instead graduate in July or August. Operational squadrons expecting replacement crews to make up for combat losses would wait longer. The bomber offensive's growth trajectory would plateau temporarily while training recovered. If the Cologne raid succeeded spectacularly, demonstrating strategic bombing's potential and securing bomber command's future, the temporary training disruption would be justified. If the raid failed, if casualties were catastrophic, if weather forced cancellation, then Harris would have crippled his own training infrastructure for nothing. The gamble extended beyond a single night's operations to encompass Bomber Command's institutional future. On the evening of May 29th, Harris surveyed the final force composition and recognised both achievement and vulnerability. He had assembled 1,047 bombers, the largest air fleet in history, but this force represented everything Bomber Command possessed: every aircraft that could fly, every crew that could be mobilised, every resource pushed to maximum utilisation. There was no reserve force if things went wrong. There was no second wave if the first proved insufficient. This was maximum effort in the most literal sense, the maximum that could possibly be done with available resources at that moment in time. And the plan now depended on weather remaining favourable, on German defences not inflicting catastrophic losses, on the bomber stream concept proving viable in practice rather than just in theory. Harris had scraped the barrel successfully. Whether what emerged from the barrel could actually destroy Cologne would be determined in approximately 24 hours. The curtain covering the target map at RAF Scampton hung motionless in the still air of the briefing room at 1400 hours on May 30th, 1942. 120 aircrew from 49 Squadron and 83 Squadron sat in rows of wooden chairs, smoking cigarettes and making the nervous jokes that always preceded mission briefings. They knew something unusual was happening. The station had been buzzing with rumours for days about a maximum effort operation. Ground crews had been working around the clock. Every serviceable aircraft on the field had been bombed up and fuelled. But until the curtain was pulled back, revealing the red ribbon stretching from their base to the target, the crews didn't know where they were going. Squadron Leader Thomas, the briefing officer, gripped the curtain cord and pulled. The ribbon extended across the North Sea, across Holland, into Germany, terminating at a point on the Rhine. A collective groan rippled through the room. Cologne. The groan wasn't fear exactly, though fear was present. It was recognition. Cologne meant heavy flak. Cologne meant searchlights. Cologne meant night fighters vectoring in from Dutch airfields. Cologne meant a 3.5-hour flight into the most defended airspace in Western Germany. Thomas waited for the noise to subside before delivering the information that transformed the groan into stunned silence. Gentlemen, tonight you will be part of the largest air raid in history. Over 1,000 aircraft will attack Cologne between 2300 hours and 0130. Your squadron will contribute 12 Lancasters to this effort. The silence held for several seconds before dissolving into excited conversation. 1,000 aircraft. The number seemed impossible. Bomber Command typically sent 50 to 100 aircraft on major raids. 1,000 meant something unprecedented, something that might actually overwhelm Cologne's defences through sheer concentration. The detailed briefing that followed contained information both reassuring and alarming, in equal measure. The reassuring parts, GEE navigation, would guide them to Cologne with unprecedented accuracy. The bomber stream would concentrate 1,000 aircraft into a 70-mile-long column, reducing each individual aircraft's exposure to fighters. The moon would provide excellent visibility for target identification. The weather forecast predicted clear skies over Cologne. The alarming parts, the raid would be concentrated into 90 minutes, meaning at peak intensity, one aircraft would arrive over Cologne every 6 seconds. The risk of mid-air collision was acknowledged but classified as acceptable. Expected losses were estimated at 5%, which meant 50 aircraft wouldn't return. For a 12-aircraft squadron, 5% meant better than even odds that everyone would come back, but statistics offered little comfort to individual crews calculating their personal survival probabilities. The route briefing traced the path they would fly. Take off between 2200 and 2300 hours, assemble over the North Sea, cross the Dutch coast near Ijmuiden, turn southeast toward Cologne, maintaining altitudes between 8,000 and 20,000 feet depending on aircraft type. The return route would swing through Belgium before turning northwest toward England, avoiding the Dutch coastal flak concentrations that had claimed so many bombers on previous raids. Flight time to target, 1 hour 50 minutes. Time over target, approximately 10 minutes. Return flight time, 2 hours. 15 minutes. Total mission duration, approximately 4.5 hours. Fuel would be tight for aircraft encountering headwinds or needing to take evasive action. Crews were briefed to monitor fuel consumption carefully and, if necessary, make emergency landings at forward bases on the English coast rather than attempt to reach their home stations. The flak briefing delivered by the intelligence officer was simultaneously specific and understated. Cologne's defences included 54 heavy flak batteries, their locations marked on the target map with red circles. Each battery comprised 4 to 6 88mm guns capable of firing 15 to 20 rounds per minute to altitudes of 26,000 feet. Simple mathematics revealed the defensive firepower. 54 batteries times 5 guns, average times 15 rounds per minute, equals approximately 4,000 shells per minute being fired at the bomber stream. Over 90 minutes, that totaled 360,000 rounds of 88mm ammunition. The intelligence officer didn't dwell on these numbers, instead emphasising that the bomber stream's concentration would saturate the defences, preventing gunners from concentrating fire on individual aircraft. What he didn't say, but what veteran crews understood, was that 360,000 shells fired into a 70-mile-long column of 1,000 aircraft guaranteed some shells would find targets. The wireless operator brief covered frequencies, call signs, and emergency procedures, with particular emphasis on maintaining radio silence until returning to England. German signals intelligence monitored British bomber transmissions and used them to track raid progress and vector night fighters to intercept. Any aircraft transmitting over enemy territory was helping the Germans kill British bombers. Exceptions were permitted only for genuine emergencies, aircraft in distress needing to call for help from other aircraft in the stream. The wireless operators nodded understanding while privately acknowledging that if their aircraft was badly damaged and going down, they would break radio silence to call for help regardless of orders. The dead couldn't be court-martialed for violating radio discipline. The bombing brief revealed the complexity of coordinating 1,000 aircraft over a single target. The raid was divided into 3 waves, each wave further subdivided into groups bombing at different altitudes. First wave aircraft, primarily heavy bombers like Stirlings and Halifaxes, would attack from 18,000 to 20,000 feet, dropping a mix of high explosive and incendiary bombs to start fires. Second-wave aircraft would bomb from 12,000 to 16,000 feet, using the fires from the first wave as aiming points. Third-wave aircraft, including older types from training units, would bomb from 8,000 to 12,000 feet, feeding the fires already burning. Each crew received specific bombing heights, timing, and approach directions designed to prevent aircraft bombing other aircraft. The plan assumed perfect adherence to briefed heights and timing. Combat rarely achieved perfection, but the plan was the best that could be devised for organising controlled chaos. The meteorological briefing delivered the forecast that made the entire operation possible. Clear skies over Cologne, visibility 8 to 10 miles, winds light and variable, moon 83% illuminated. The Met Officer's confidence in this forecast was qualified with the standard caveat that weather forecasting was inexact science. But the anticyclone over Western Germany appeared stable and showed no signs of unexpected movement. Crews listened to the weather brief with particular attention because weather determined everything. Cloud cover obscuring Cologne would mean bombing blind, scattering ordnance uselessly across the countryside. Strong winds would increase fuel consumption and navigation errors. The forecast was as good as could be hoped for. Whether the forecast would prove accurate wouldn't be known until they were over Germany. The final portion of the briefing covered escape and evasion procedures for crews shot down over occupied Europe. Information delivered with bureaucratic efficiency that barely concealed the grim reality it addressed. Carry escape maps concealed in uniform linings. Carry foreign currency for bribing civilians. Destroy all classified materials before abandoning aircraft. Attempt to evade capture and reach neutral territory in Spain or Switzerland. Contact the underground resistance if possible. The unspoken truth was that most airmen shot down over Germany were captured within hours, spending the remainder of the war in prisoner of war camps, if they were lucky, dying of injuries if they weren't. The briefing officer concluded with the standard phrase, "Gentlemen, good luck and good hunting." The crews filed out of the briefing room into the late afternoon sun, heading to their crew rooms to collect flight gear and attempt to eat something despite the nervous tension building in their stomachs. Peter Melender, a 21-year-old pilot officer flying his 8th operation, sat at a small desk in the crew quarters and composed a letter to his parents in Sheffield. The letter followed a formula he had developed over previous missions: cheerful optimism about his health and the weather, vague references to another operation tonight without specifying location or target, reassurances that his crew was skilled and his aircraft reliable. What the letter didn't mention was that Malander had calculated the loss rate statistics and understood that completing a 30-operation tour gave him approximately even odds of survival. What the letter didn't mention was that he had witnessed 3 crews from his squadron fail to return in the past month. 21 men simply erased from the squadron roster. What the letter didn't mention was the recurring nightmare where his Lancaster exploded in midair and he had perhaps 3 seconds to understand he was dying before the impact that ended thought. He signed the letter, "Your loving son, Peter," sealed it, and left it on his bunk. If he didn't return, the squadron adjutant would mail it to his parents, along with the official telegram reporting his death. The ritual of writing the last letter had become routine, though routine didn't make it easier. The hours between briefing and takeoff stretched interminably, time moving at the peculiar pace of pre-mission, waiting where minutes felt like hours and hours vanished in moments. Some crews played cards, some wrote letters, some slept or attempted to sleep, achieving fitful dozing rather than genuine rest. Some simply sat and smoked, conversation dying as takeoff approached, and each man retreated into his own thoughts about what the night might bring. The squadron chaplain circulated through the crew rooms, offering conversation to those who wanted it, respecting the silence of those who didn't. He had learned over months of these pre-mission hours that some men found comfort in prayer while others found comfort in silence, and that imposing unwanted spiritual consolation was cruelty disguised as ministry. At 2100 hours, 3 hours before takeoff, the mess served what would be their last meal before the operation: eggs, toast, tea. The eggs were powdered reconstituted protein, the toast was margarine rather than butter, the tea was weak, but the meal was traditional and therefore comforting in its familiarity. At 21:30, crews began collecting their flight gear and walking toward the dispersal areas where their aircraft waited. Hauptmann Werner Weber stood in the emplacement of Flak Battery 437 in the Cologne-Deutz district on the afternoon of May 30th, 1942, supervising routine drill with the casual authority of an officer who had commanded the same battery for 18 months. His crew had manned their four 88mm guns through 106 RAF raids since May of 1940, becoming efficient at the choreography of air defence. Detect incoming aircraft via sound locators and searchlights, calculate range and altitude, set fuses, load shells, track targets, fire. They could complete the cycle in under 30 seconds, putting 4 shells into the air before the first shell detonated. Tonight would be routine, Weber assumed. The British usually sent 20 to 30 bombers to Cologne. His battery would fire several hundred rounds. Perhaps they would hit something, perhaps not. By 0 to 200 hours they would stand down, exhausted and deaf from the gun blasts, and resume normal duties the next morning. The Civil Defence Headquarters in downtown Cologne operated with similar expectations of routine when the preliminary alert arrived at 2100 hours. Luftlage England, multiple bomber formations assembling over England direction Germany. Gauleiter Josef Grohe, the Nazi Party official responsible for Cologne's defence, reviewed the shelter capacity reports without particular concern. Official public shelters could accommodate 60,000 people. Thousands more would shelter in basement areas of apartment buildings and private homes. The system had functioned adequately through 106 previous raids. Casualties had been manageable, damage had been contained, and civil defence services had demonstrated their competence. The alert meant another night of disrupted sleep and temporary evacuation to shelters. But Cologne had endured worse. The city's residents had developed practiced efficiency in their response to air raid warnings. They would endure this raid as they had endured all the others. Anna Krohn heard the preliminary sirens begin wailing at 21:15, while preparing dinner for her 2 children in their apartment near the Dom Cathedral. The sound triggered automatic response rather than panic. She turned off the stove, gathered her emergency suitcase that had been packed and ready since 1940, called to her children to put on coats and shoes, and prepared to descend to the basement shelter the building shared with neighbouring structures. This ritual had been performed dozens of times, and it had always ended the same way. Several hours in a crowded basement listening to distant explosions, then the all-clear siren, then returning to the apartment to find everything intact. The routine had created a false sense that air raids were survivable inconveniences rather than genuine threats. Anna locked her apartment door, took her children's hands, and joined the flow of residents descending the stairwell toward the basement, chatting with neighbours about the disruption to their evening plans. The night fighter crews at Duel airfield in the occupied Netherlands received their mission briefing at 2200 hours with the same expectations of another standard defensive operation. Oberleutnant Ludwig Becker, who had already achieved 12 confirmed kills flying Messerschmitt 1 to 10 night fighters, listened to the tactical officer outline the anticipated raid. Estimated 30 to 50 British bombers heading toward the Ruhr industrial area, possibly targeting Essen or Cologne, expected arrival time around midnight. Becker's crew himself, as pilot, his radar operator, and his gunner would patrol a designated sector over western Germany, vectored by ground controllers toward bomber formations detected by the Freya radar stations along the Dutch coast. It was the same mission they had flown twice weekly for months. Becker expected to make 1, perhaps 2 interceptions if British bomber tactics were sloppy and German ground control was efficient. He did not expect to find himself flying through a formation so dense with British bombers that the problem wasn't finding targets but choosing which targets to engage. The Searchlight Regiment responsible for illuminating Cologne's airspace conducted equipment checks as the preliminary alert escalated to full air raid warning at 22:45. 282 searchlights positioned around Cologne and in surrounding countryside waited to snap on when aircraft were detected. Their carbon arc lamps, capable of producing beams visible for miles that could cone bombers in multiple overlapping lights, blinding crews and marking targets for flak batteries. The searchlight crews had developed tactics through experience. Catch a bomber in one light, immediately bring other lights to bear, creating a cone, hold the cone while flak batteries fired. On good nights, they could cone and hold 3 or 4 aircraft per hour. On bad nights, the bombers evaded successfully, diving and turning to escape the lights. Tonight, the searchlight crews expected a normal defensive operation. What they got instead was a sky so full of aircraft that the searchlights became almost superfluous, their beams illuminating not individual bombers, but entire formations. The Cologne police and fire services positioned personnel at their stations by 2300 hours, preparing for the post-raid work that always followed British attacks. Fighting fires, clearing rubble, evacuating wounded, recovering bodies. The city's fire service comprised 15 fire stations with approximately 300 professional firefighters, supplemented by several thousand auxiliary firefighters drawn from civilian volunteers. This force had proven adequate for previous raids, where fires numbered in the dozens rather than thousands. The equipment was standard for German civil defence: fire engines with pumps, hundreds of metres of hose, axes and crowbars for breaking through collapsed structures, first aid equipment for treating injured civilians. What Cologne's fire service didn't possess, what no city's fire service possessed in 1942, was capacity to fight thousands of fires simultaneously burning across dozens of square kilometres. The challenge they were about to face wasn't controlling individual fires, but triaging an entire city burning in multiple locations at once. The civilian population of Cologne, having responded to air raid warnings over 100 times in the previous 2 years, followed established routines without panic or particular urgency. Families gathered essential belongings, descended to shelters, and waited for the raid to pass. Some shelters had developed communities of regulars, the same families sheltering together night after night, developing shared routines and dark humour about British punctuality. Children treated the shelter descents as adventures rather than threats. Excitement at staying up late, overcoming any fear of danger they barely understood. The adults knew better, but maintained calm for the children's sake. Conversation in the shelters focusing on ordinary topics, deliberately mundane as bombs began falling somewhere in the distance. The sound of explosions filtered into the basement shelters as muffled thumps, close explosions creating pressure waves felt in the chest, distant explosions barely audible. Experience had taught Cologne's residents to gauge danger by sound. Very close explosions meant immediate threat. Distant explosions meant someone else's neighbourhood was being hit. Tonight, the sounds would change from distant to omnipresent, from someone else's danger to everyone's catastrophe. At 23:30 hours, Hauptmann Weber's battery received a report from Central Air Defence Coordination that fundamentally challenged his understanding of what was approaching. Alert all batteries. Estimated hostile aircraft strength exceeds 500. Repeat, exceeds 500 aircraft. Weber read the message twice, certain it was an error, perhaps a decimal point misplacement. 500 aircraft was impossible. The largest RAF raid on Cologne had involved perhaps 70 aircraft. 500 was a number that made no sense, that exceeded anything in German defensive planning or tactical doctrine. He ordered his battery to maximum readiness while awaiting confirmation. The confirmation arrived 10 minutes later. Revised estimate. Hostile aircraft strength exceeds 1,000. Weber stared at the message, then at his 4 guns and their crews of 32 men, and understood with absolute clarity that whatever was about to happen, his battery's 4 guns would be entirely inadequate to the task. The German radar operators at Freya stations along the Dutch coast watched their screens with growing confusion and alarm as the British formations crossed the North Sea. The radar returns showed not dozens of aircraft, but hundreds, far beyond anything the operators had observed before. Telephone lines to Luftwaffe Command Headquarters crackled with reports that sounded like equipment malfunction. We're counting over 300 contacts. We're showing 400 plus. Impossible to maintain accurate count. Formations overlap. The standard night fighter interception doctrine assumed German controllers could vector fighters to specific bomber formations, coordinating attacks on small groups. But when the radar showed a continuous stream of aircraft stretching across hundreds of kilometres of sky, vectoring became meaningless. The fighters would simply fly into the stream and find targets everywhere. The British had changed the game, and Germany's carefully developed defensive tactics were suddenly obsolete. At 2 minutes before midnight, on May 30th to 31st, 1942, Cologne existed in 2 simultaneous states. The physical city continued functioning. 768,000 people in shelters and homes. Anti-aircraft batteries at maximum. Readiness. Fire services positioned for response. Civil defence organisations prepared for routine damage control. The target city existed 300 miles away in 1,000 British bombers converging on the Rhine, bomb bays loaded with high explosive and incendiaries, crews running through final checks before arriving over the target. These 2 cities, the lived city and the target city, were about to collide with industrial violence concentrated in 90 minutes. When the collision ended and dawn broke over the Rhine, only one of these cities would still exist. The Cologne that emerged on May 31st would be fundamentally, irrevocably different from the Cologne that had existed the night before. The transformation was approaching at 200 miles per hour, carried in bomb bays and measured in tonnage. The defenders couldn't stop it. They could only survive it, or not. The first Lancaster's 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines coughed to life at RAF Waddington at 2200 hours on May 30th, 1942. Their combined 6,000 horsepower, creating a sound that rattled windows in the control tower. Within minutes, across 53 airfields scattered across eastern England, the night filled with the thunder of thousands of engines starting in sequence, a mechanical symphony building toward operational pitch. Ground crews pulled wheel chocks, pilots advanced throttles, and the first aircraft of Operation Millennium began taxiing toward runways. The logistics of launching 1,047 bombers within a 2-hour window tested every aspect of RAF organisation, transforming the countryside of Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and East Anglia into an assembly line of departure, where every 90 seconds another bomber lifted into darkness. The takeoff from RAF Marham, home station for 3 Wellington squadrons, demonstrated the controlled chaos that made the operation possible and the razor-thin margins that separated success from catastrophe. 18 Wellingtons taxied onto the runway in sequence, one aircraft reaching takeoff position as the previous aircraft broke ground and began climbing. The runway controller watched aircraft separate into the darkness through binoculars, timing intervals to prevent collisions while maintaining the departure schedule that would put Marham's aircraft into their assigned position in the bomber stream. 2 Wellingtons converged on the runway simultaneously from different taxiways, their navigation lights creating intersecting arcs of red and green. The controller's voice cracked over the radio. Wellington Charlie Dog, hold position, give way to Baker 3. Charlie Dog's pilot stood on his brakes, pulling up short while Baker 3 accelerated past, missing collision by perhaps 50 metres. The margin between operational success and disaster measured that night in seconds and metres, held by the narrowest threads. The night sky over East Anglia, filled with aircraft at multiple altitudes, as bomber streams from different bases climbed operational height and turned toward assembly points over the North Sea. Pilots maintained visual separation when possible, watching for the navigation lights of other aircraft while climbing through the darkness, trying to avoid mid-air collisions in airspace that had never been this crowded. The collision that occurred at 23:15 happened too quickly for either crew to react. A Wellington from 103 Squadron, climbing through 5,000 feet, intersected the flight path of a Hampden from 408 Squadron, descending from 6,000 feet after encountering engine problems. The aircraft struck almost head-on, the Wellington's nose crushing the Hampden's cockpit in an impact that killed both crews instantly. The wreckage fell burning into farmland near Market Raisin, witnessed by dozens of other aircraft crews who saw the explosion and understood what it meant, but continued their climb, because turning back was not an option. The coastal towns of eastern England experienced the raid's departure as an audible phenomenon. An hour of continuous engine noise as 1,000 bombers passed overhead at altitudes ranging from 50 feet to 10,000 feet. Fishermen working night tides in small boats off the Norfolk coast watched the navigation light streams pass above, aircraft too numerous to count creating a river of red and green lights flowing east toward Europe. Some fishermen who had served in the previous war understood what they were witnessing, the largest air armada in history passing overhead toward Germany. Others simply watched in awe at the spectacle of industrial war made visible. Power measured in thousands of horsepower and tons of bombs heading toward people they would never see in a city, most of them couldn't locate on a map. The Bomber Streams organisation existed more in planning documents than in actual execution. The plan called for aircraft to assemble into a 70-mile-long column, 5 miles wide, with aircraft stacked at different altitudes to prevent collisions. Reality produced something messier. A loosely organised flow of aircraft heading generally toward Cologne, bunching in some areas where faster aircraft caught up with slower aircraft, spreading in other areas where navigation errors created gaps in the stream. GEE navigation helped maintain lateral organisation, with navigators able to check their position relative to the planned track and make corrections. But altitude separation depended on pilots holding their briefed heights precisely. a challenge when aircraft weights varied with bomb loads and fuel consumption, when turbulence created updrafts and downdrafts, when the darkness prevented pilots from seeing how close they were flying to other aircraft sharing the same airspace. The first aircraft abort occurred at 23:32 hours, a Halifax from 35 Squadron, experiencing complete hydraulic failure that left the pilot unable to control the aircraft's landing gear or bomb bay doors. The pilot faced a choice: continue to Cologne in an aircraft that couldn't drop its bombs and couldn't land safely upon return, or abort the mission, jettison bombs in the North Sea, and make an emergency landing at the nearest airfield. He chose survival, informing his crew they were turning back, and began the careful process of flying a crippled bomber back to England, while other aircraft in the stream continued east. The Halifax was the first of many aborts that night, aircraft turning back due to engine failures, electrical problems, oxygen system malfunctions, and the 1,000 small mechanical failures that made every bombing raid a test of equipment reliability as much as crew skill. Peter Mallender, flying Lancaster F Fox from RAF Scampton, crossed the English coast at 23:55 hours and turned southeast toward the Dutch coast. His navigator hunched over the GEE set in the nose, watching the hyperbolic lines on the cathode screen intersect at points that confirmed they were precisely on track. Mallender could see other aircraft around him now that his eyes had adapted to darkness, navigation lights creating constellation patterns at multiple altitudes, some lights ahead, some behind, some to either side. The bomber stream was working, concentrating aircraft into a manageable flow, heading toward the same target at approximately the same time. But concentration created its own dangers. Mallender kept careful watch for other aircraft that might drift into his flight path. Aware that a mid-air collision at night over the North Sea meant death without possibility of rescue, bodies and wreckage swallowed by cold water that preserved nothing. The approach to the Dutch coast brought the first contact with German defences. Flak batteries along the coastline opening fire on the bomber stream as it made landfall near Ijmuiden. The flak was light and inaccurate, coastal batteries firing at maximum range toward estimated positions rather than visually acquired targets. But it served notice that defensive airspace began here. Traces arced upward in streams of red and orange, deceptively beautiful when observed from a distance, deadly when they found their targets. Mallender watched a Wellington ahead and to his left take a hit, seeing the flash of a flak burst coincide with the aircraft's position, followed by fire erupting from the port wing. The Wellington continued flying for perhaps 30 seconds before beginning a gentle descent that steepened into a dive, fire spreading across the wing and fuselage until the entire aircraft was burning. Mallender didn't see any parachutes emerge before the Wellington descended below his line of sight and disappeared into darkness. First confirmed loss of the night, with Cologne still 150 miles ahead. The turn southeast toward Cologne marked the point where the operation became irreversible. Behind them was England, safety, the possibility of emergency landing if something went wrong. Ahead was Germany, defended airspace, flak, and fighters, and the certainty that at least some aircraft in the stream wouldn't return. But there was no turning back without aborting the mission. And aborting meant facing questions about why you didn't continue when 1,000 other aircraft did. Mallender checked his fuel gauges, confirmed they showed adequate reserves for the target run and return flight, and settled into the long, straight approach toward Cologne. His bomb aimer, Sergeant Phillips, began his pre-bombing checks. Bomb doors tested, bomb selector verified, bomb sight calibrated and ready. In 45 minutes they would be over Cologne, and the question of whether they would survive the next 3 hours would be answered one way or another. The final aircraft took off from RAF Chedborough at 3 minutes before midnight, a Wellington, from a training unit crewed by an instructor pilot and 5 students, the last of 1,047 bombers dispatched into darkness toward the same target. Ground crews at all 53 airfields watched the final aircraft depart, then began the waiting that would last until aircraft started returning in approximately 4 hours. Some ground crews went to their barracks to sleep. Others remained on the flight line, standing in small groups, smoking cigarettes, watching the eastern sky where the bomber stream had disappeared. They knew the statistics as well as the aircrew did. 5% losses meant 50 aircraft wouldn't return, meaning 350 men their own age would die tonight or be captured. But statistics didn't reveal which specific aircraft would be lost, which specific crews would fail to return, which specific names would be struck from tomorrow's duty roster. That knowledge would come at dawn when the survivors landed and the Gaps in the formations revealed who was missing. Until then, there was nothing to do but wait. The first GEE navigators began reporting fixes at 00:15 hours as the bomber stream crossed from the Netherlands into German airspace, their cathode screens displaying intersection patterns that confirmed positions with unprecedented accuracy. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison, navigating a Halifax from 76 Squadron, plotted his position at exactly 5 miles north of track, calculated the correction needed, and passed the heading change to his pilot. Across the bomber stream, hundreds of navigators performed identical calculations, making small course adjustments that pulled the scattered aircraft back toward the planned route to Cologne. The result was concentration beyond anything attempted before in aerial warfare. 1,000 aircraft, funneling into a corridor roughly 5 miles wide and 70 miles long, aircraft stacked from 8,000 to 20,000 feet, moving at speeds between 180 and 220 miles per hour toward the same geographic coordinates. The Freya radar station at Venlo in the Netherlands tracked the approaching bomber stream with equipment never designed to handle this volume of contacts. The radar operator watched his screen fill with returns until individual aircraft became indistinguishable from the mass, a solid block of reflected radar energy moving southeast toward Cologne. His report to Luftwaffe Fighter Control sounded like equipment malfunction. "I'm showing one continuous formation. Impossible to count individual aircraft. Estimate minimum 500, possibly much higher." The controller demanded confirmation, certain the operator was misreading his equipment. The confirmation came from other radar stations reporting identical readings. The British had somehow assembled an air fleet that exceeded anything in German defensive planning, a concentration that invalidated the standard fighter interception doctrine based on finding individual bombers scattered across hundreds of miles of sky. Oberleutnant Ludwig Becker, flying his Messerschmitt 1-10 night fighter at 12,000 feet near the Dutch-German border, received vectors from ground control that initially confused him. Steer 130 degrees, hostile formation, at your altitude, range 15 kilometers. Becker turned to the indicated heading, expecting to spend the next 20 minutes hunting for a lone bomber or small formation. Instead, his radar operator called out contact after contact. "I'm showing multiple returns, very close spacing, looks like at least 20 aircraft within 5 kilometers. Becker reduced speed and climbed slightly, positioning for interception, and then saw what his radar had detected. The bomber stream stretched ahead of him like a river of aircraft, navigation lights creating a ribbon of red and green that extended to the horizon. He had never seen anything like it, had never imagined it possible. He positioned behind a Lancaster, flying slightly below him, closed to 200 meters, and opened fire. The Lancaster's port wing erupted in flame. Becker broke away, selected another target from the dozens visible, and attacked again. This was target-rich environment beyond any fighter pilot's fantasy, but it was also desperately inadequate. One fighter attacking 1,000 bombers was arithmetic that meant the bomber stream would reach its target regardless of how many individual aircraft Becker destroyed. The mid-air collision at 00:37 hours occurred over Aachen, witnessed by dozens of crews in the bomber stream who saw the explosion and understood immediately what had happened. A Wellington from 405 Squadron, flying at 12,000 feet, collided with a Hamden from 408 Squadron that had drifted above its assigned altitude and into the Wellington's flight path. The impact tore the Wellington's tail section away and sheared the Hamden's starboard wing at the root. Both aircraft entered immediate, uncontrolled spins, wreckage tumbling through the air in burning pieces. Several crews reported seeing parachutes emerge from the wreckage, at least some crewmen successfully bailing out, but whether those parachutes belonged to survivors or corpses couldn't be determined from the brief glimpses other crews caught while flying past at 200 miles per hour. The collision was the second of 4 that would occur during the approach to Cologne, each one demonstrating the lethal arithmetic of packing 1,000 aircraft into limited airspace. The bomber stream's density created its own form of defence against night fighters despite the initial success of pilots like Becker. German night fighter tactics in 1942 relied on ground controllers, vectoring fighters to intercept individual bombers or small formations, a process that typically required 20 to 45 minutes of patient tracking and positioning before a successful interception could be achieved. But the bomber stream eliminated the search phase entirely. Fighters could simply fly into the stream and find targets immediately. This apparent advantage was offset by the overwhelming number of targets. With perhaps 15 German night fighters airborne over Western Germany that night, and 1,000 British bombers in the stream, each fighter could theoretically shoot down 3 or 4 bombers, and the raid would still proceed with minimal impact. The Germans achieved exactly this arithmetic. Night fighters successfully shot down 12 bombers during the approach to Cologne. A success rate that would have been devastating in a normal 50 aircraft raid, but was strategically meaningless against a 1,000 aircraft raid. The bomber stream's concentration protected the formation through numbers rather than dispersion. The approach to Cologne became visible from approximately 30 miles as the first wave of bombers began their attack, runs at 00:42 hours. Crews flying in following waves saw the glow on the horizon initially, orange light reflecting off low clouds, growing brighter as they approached. Peter Malander, still 25 miles from Cologne, saw the first fires start, small points of light multiplying and spreading, fed by incendiaries dropped from the leading aircraft. His bomb aimer, Sergeant Phillips, came on the intercom. "Looks like the Pathfinders are making good work of it, Skipper. We should have plenty of light to aim by," Malander acknowledged, focusing on holding his altitude and heading as instructed, watching other aircraft around him converge toward the growing firestorm ahead. The searchlight defenses activated as the first wave entered Cologne's airspace, 282 searchlights snapping on simultaneously and sweeping the sky in patterns designed to catch and cone bombers. The lights created surreal landscape of white beams crisscrossing at multiple angles, illuminating aircraft that strayed into them with harsh brilliance that blinded crews. A Halifax from 76 Squadron was caught in 3 searchlights simultaneously while making its bombing run, the pilot blinded by the glare, unable to see his instruments or the horizon. He threw the Halifax into a dive to escape the lights, descending 4,000 feet in 30 seconds while his flight engineer called out altitude and the rest of the crew hung on against the G-forces. The Halifax escaped the searchlights but flew directly into the flak barrage at 8,000 feet, the worst possible altitude for flak accuracy. The aircraft took 3 direct hits in 5 seconds, killing the tail gunner instantly and setting the fuselage on fire. The pilot ordered bailout. 4 crew members escaped via the escape hatches. 3, including the pilot, went down with the aircraft when it crashed in Cologne's eastern suburbs at 00:56 hours. The flak batteries opened fire at maximum rate as the bomber stream arrived overhead, Hauptmann Weber's Battery 437 firing its 4 88mm guns in continuous barrage that consumed ammunition faster than the loaders could maintain supply. Weber stood in the command position, calling out ranges and elevations based on visual tracking of aircraft illuminated by searchlights, while his crews worked with mechanical efficiency born of 18 months of practice. Fire, reload, adjust, fire again, the cycle repeating every 20 seconds per gun. The noise was overwhelming, the 88mm gun producing a crack boom signature that made conversation impossible without shouting. Weber watched his crews work and simultaneously watched the sky overhead, seeing dozens of aircraft where he had expected to see 20 or 30, understanding that his battery's efforts were entirely inadequate to the scale of the attack they faced. They could shoot down aircraft, they were shooting down aircraft, he could see bombers burning and falling from the sky, but they couldn't shoot down enough to stop the raid. The approach to the target became a sensory overload for bomber crews. Searchlights sweeping, flak bursts creating orange flowers of explosive force at their altitude, tracers arcing upward in streams, fires burning across the city below, providing both target illumination and evidence of the destruction already inflicted. Crews had to navigate through this chaos while maintaining formation discipline, holding altitude, and heading despite every survival instinct screaming at them to take evasive action. The bomb aimers took control of the aircraft for the bombing run, issuing small corrections to pilots while tracking their aiming points through bomb sites. Left, left, steady, steady. Hold it. The bombs fell in sticks, high explosive, and incendiaries tumbling from bomb bays toward the city, 3 miles below. The aircraft lurched upward as several thousand pounds of bombs dropped away, suddenly lighter and more maneuverable. Pilots banked away from the target, heading southwest toward Belgium and the return route to England, their part of the operation complete. Behind them, the city burned. The first bombs struck Cologne at 00:47 hours on May 31st, 1942, 4 500-pound high-explosive bombs falling in a stick across the Neumarkt district from a Sterling of 7 squadron. The explosions blossomed in sequence, orange flashes followed by smoke and dust, demolishing 4 buildings and creating craters in the street that exposed water mains and electrical conduits. The fires that started in the wreckage were small initially, but they marked the beginning of a process that would not stop for 90 minutes. Every 15 seconds, another aircraft arrived over Cologne. Every 15 seconds, more bombs fell. The mathematics of destruction accumulated with industrial precision. 1 aircraft, 3,000 pounds of bombs, 15-second intervals, 90 minutes. The calculation produced 1,455 tons of high explosive and incendiaries delivered at a rate that guaranteed Cologne's fire services would be overwhelmed before the raid was 1/3 complete. Hauptmann Werner Weber's flak battery fired into the bomber stream with desperate intensity, but the sheer number of targets made precise aiming impossible. Weber abandoned the attempt to track individual aircraft and instead ordered his guns to fire barrage patterns at altitude, creating zones of exploding shells that aircraft would have to fly through rather than targeting specific bombers. The tactic was statistically sound but viscerally unsatisfying, transforming the gunners from hunters targeting prey into farmers harvesting whatever their fields produced. The 88mm guns fired until the barrels glowed, red with heat, until the crew's ears bled from the concussion, until the ammunition supply points began running low and runners had to sprint back and forth with fresh shells. Weber watched aircraft burn and fall, but couldn't determine which aircraft his battery had hit versus which had been damaged by other batteries. The battle had become too large, too chaotic, for individual actions to be distinguishable from the collective effort. The incendiary cascade that engulfed the Altstadt Nord district began at 0105 hours when a Wellington from 419 Squadron dropped its full load of 94-pound incendiary bombs in a single stick across the medieval quarter. Each incendiary was a magnesium device that burned at 1800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to ignite wood and fabric on contact, too hot to be extinguished with water. The 90 incendiaries scattered across 3 city blocks, landing on roofs, crashing through windows, embedding in wooden floors. Within 8 minutes, 17 buildings were burning. Within 20 minutes, the fires had merged into a single conflagration that created its own weather system. Updrafts pulling oxygen into the firebase, while smoke columns rose 15,000 feet above the city. This pattern repeated across Cologne. Individual incendiary bombs, starting individual fires that merged into area fires that overwhelmed the response capacity of the city's 15 fire stations. Anna Krohn huddled in the basement shelter with 240 other people in a space designed for 80. The crowding so severe that sitting was impossible, everyone standing pressed against neighbours while the building shook from nearby explosions. The shelter had electric lighting initially, but the power failed at 0112 hours, plunging them into darkness, broken only by a few emergency candles. The air became thick with dust and the smell of fear sweat, the ventilation system inadequate for this many people in this small a space. Children cried. Adults tried to comfort them while fighting their own terror. The explosions came in waves, sometimes close enough that the concrete walls transmitted the shock directly into their bodies, sometimes more distant but still felt as vibrations through the floor. Anna had experienced many air raids. But this was different. This wasn't stopping. This was continuous bombardment, with no pause, no respite, no indication it would ever end. She held her children close and prayed to a God whose presence in this basement was questionable at best. Peter Mallander's Lancaster approached Cologne at 0119 hours, and the scene below resembled nothing in his previous 7 operations. The entire city appeared to be burning, hundreds of individual fires creating a glow visible from 50 miles away. Smoke columns rose to his altitude and above it, creating turbulence that buffeted his Lancaster and required constant control inputs to maintain stable flight. His bomb aimer, Sergeant Phillips, struggled to identify specific aiming points through the smoke and fire, finally selecting a dark area adjacent to fires as his target, reasoning that bombing areas not yet burning would spread the destruction. The bombs dropped away, 6,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiaries adding to the conflagration below. Mallander banked left, clearing the target area, and headed southwest toward Belgium. His rear gunner called over the intercom, "Christ, Skipper, the whole city's gone up." I can still see the fires, and we're 20 miles away. The Cologne fire service attempted response with resources that were ludicrously inadequate to the task. 15 fire stations dispatched their equipment to tackle fires that numbered in the hundreds within the first 30 minutes of the raid. Fire crews would arrive at one fire, begin deploying hoses, and receive reports of 10 more fires that had started while they were en route. The water main breaks caused by high explosive bombs eliminated water supply to large sections of the city, forcing fire crews to run hoses hundreds of meters to the Rhine River and pump water from there, a process that took 45 minutes to establish and provided insufficient pressure for fighting major fires. By 0130 hours, the fire service effectively surrendered to the scale of the disaster, abandoning any attempt at comprehensive fire suppression and instead focusing on rescue operations, extracting trapped civilians from collapsed buildings and guiding people away from areas where fires were creating the conditions for firestorms. Oberleutnant Ludwig Becker achieved his 5th kill of the night at 0123 hours, shooting down a Halifax from 76 Squadron that burned and crashed in Cologne's southern suburbs. But Becker was flying in conditions that tested his skill and his aircraft to their limits. The fires below created massive thermal updrafts and turbulence that threw his Messerschmitt 1 to 10 around the sky, despite his best control inputs. The smoke reduced visibility to near zero in some areas, forcing him to navigate by instruments while searching for targets that appeared briefly in clear areas before disappearing into smoke again. His ammunition was running low, his fuel was at 50%, and he still had to return to Diemen airfield in the Netherlands. Becker reluctantly turned northwest, leaving the bomber stream that still had 30 minutes of attack time remaining. His 5 kills represented excellent individual performance, but they were statistically meaningless against the 1,000 bomber force that continued pounding Cologne. The fire development at 0130 hours created conditions that would define the raid's ultimate impact. Approximately 2,500 individual fires burned across Cologne, their distribution roughly corresponding to the density of combustible construction in each district. Medieval quarters with timber frame buildings burned most intensely. Modern districts with concrete and steel construction burned less readily, but still burned where incendiaries found wood furnishings or flammable materials. 12 fires had developed into firestorms, creating tornado-like conditions where oxygen was pulled into the firebase with sufficient force to uproot small trees and pull debris into the flames. These firestorms generated temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius at their cores, hot enough to melt glass and crack concrete. Buildings within firestorm zones didn't simply burn, they disintegrated into ash and melted components. The final bombs fell at 0155 hours from a Wellington of 4606 Squadron, the last aircraft over the target, its crew exhausted from 4.5 hours of flying and overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. The pilot, Flying Officer Thompson, radioed a brief report to base as they cleared. Cologne's airspace, target well and truly pranged, fires visible from 100 miles. Behind them, the city burned with fires that would not be fully extinguished for 3 days. The bomber stream began dispersing as aircraft headed toward their individual bases in England via different routes designed to spread the returning aircraft across the North Sea and English coast. Some aircraft flew alone. Some flew in loose formations with other bombers heading to nearby bases. All carried crews who had witnessed something unprecedented, something that none of their previous operations had prepared them to comprehend. The defensive accounting at 0200 hours, when the final aircraft cleared Cologne's airspace, showed the bomber stream's protective effect. Flak batteries reported firing approximately 12,000 88mm rounds and perhaps 30,000 rounds of lighter anti-aircraft ammunition. They claimed 300 aircraft destroyed, a number that would be quietly revised downward when reconnaissance revealed actual British losses. Night fighters claimed 23 confirmed kills, a number approximately accurate but representing less than 2.5% of the attacking force. Searchlight crews claimed to have illuminated 190 aircraft, providing aiming references for flak batteries, but couldn't determine how many of those illuminated aircraft were actually destroyed. The defences had functioned, had shot down aircraft, had forced bombers to take evasive action that reduced bombing accuracy, but had failed in their essential mission of preventing the attack. Cologne had been hit, and hit hard, harder than any German city had been hit in the war to date. The silence that descended over Cologne after 0200 hours was broken only by the sound of burning, the crackle of flames consuming buildings, the occasional crash of structures collapsing under their own compromised weight. Emergency. Services worked in conditions bordering on chaos, fire crews fighting fires without adequate water, rescue teams pulling survivors from rubble using only hand tools and muscle power, hospitals treating wounded civilians while their own buildings burned around them. WW2 attempted to coordinate response from civil defence headquarters, but communications had broken down across large sections of the city where telephone lines were destroyed and radio equipment was buried under rubble. The organisation that had handled 106 previous raids with reasonable competence was simply overwhelmed by the scale of what had occurred. Cologne had been attacked by 1,000 bombers in 90 minutes, and no amount of preparation or organisation could have prevented the resulting devastation. The city would survive, but the city that survived would be profoundly different from the city that had existed 12 hours earlier. Anna Crone emerged from the shelter at 0600 hours into a world transformed beyond recognition. The street where her apartment building had stood was gone, replaced by a landscape of rubble and twisted metal that bore no resemblance to the familiar urban environment she had known for 34 years. The apartment building itself existed only in scattered fragments, its walls collapsed, its roof gone, its interior spaces exposed to the sky like a grotesque architectural cross-section. Her possessions, everything she owned beyond the emergency suitcase she carried, had ceased to exist. She stood on broken concrete, holding her children's hands, watching smoke rise from hundreds of fires still burning across the city, and understood with absolute clarity that her previous life had ended during the night. Whatever came next would be constructed from nothing, starting from the emergency suitcase and whatever assistance the state might provide to 45,000 people who had been made homeless in a single night. The domed cathedral stood intact amid devastation, its Gothic spires rising above the smoke like a rebuke to the destructive power that had flattened everything around it. 14 bombs had struck the cathedral during the night, most hitting the roof and causing minor structural damage that would require repair but did not threaten the building's integrity. The cathedral's survival while the surrounding city burned was partly luck, partly the massive stone construction that could absorb explosive impacts that would demolish lighter buildings, and partly the sheer volume of other targets available to bomber crews who aimed at fires rather than at the cathedral specifically. The image of the cathedral standing amid ruins would become the iconic photograph of the Cologne raid, reproduced in newspapers across Germany and Britain, interpreted by both sides as evidence supporting their respective narratives. Germans saw resilience and divine protection. British saw inadequate area, coverage and the need for future raids to complete the destruction. Gauleiter Josef Grohe convened emergency meetings at 07:30 hours with civil defence coordinators, attempting to establish some accounting of casualties and damage. Initial reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Estimates of dead ranged from 300 to over 1,000, depending on which district reported and which counting methodology was used. Reports of homeless varied from 30,000 to 60,000. Reports of destroyed buildings were impossible to verify because large sections of the city remained inaccessible due to rubble blocking streets and fires still burning. Grohe ordered systematic street-by-street assessment but understood that accurate information would take days to compile. What was immediately clear was that Cologne had experienced catastrophe beyond anything in the city's modern history. The previous worst raid had destroyed approximately 500 buildings. This raid had destroyed tens of thousands. The scale difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. A transformation from manageable emergency to civic disaster. The RAF Reconnaissance Spitfire that photographed Cologne at 09:45 hours flew at 28,000 feet above the smoke columns that still rose 15,000 feet from the largest fires. Flight officer Wilfried Lockhart, the pilot, had photographed Cologne twice before routine reconnaissance missions that documented a largely intact city with scattered bomb damage. What he photographed on May 31st was fundamentally different. The camera captured smoke obscuring entire districts, fires creating their own weather systems, and even through the smoke, the geometric patterns of destroyed city blocks, visible as lighter patches where buildings had been reduced to rubble. Lockhart made 3 passes over the city at different angles, ensuring comprehensive coverage, then turned west toward England. His photographs would be developed, analysed, and distributed within 12 hours, providing the first objective assessment of the raid's effectiveness. The civil defence documentation effort created photographic and film evidence that propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels would later suppress. Camera crews dispatched to document damage for official records, captured images of destruction that exceeded anything German civilians had witnessed, streets reduced to rubble, entire neighborhoods burning without control, survivors wandering through ruins in shock. Goebbels, reviewing the footage, immediately ordered it classified. If this footage appeared in newsreels, if German civilians across the Reich saw what had happened to Cologne, morale would collapse. The official narrative would acknowledge that Cologne had been attacked by a large British force, would admit to significant damage, but would emphasise resilience, reconstruction, and revenge. The true scale of destruction, the 45,000 homeless, the thousands of buildings destroyed, the casualties that exceeded all previous raids combined, these facts would be carefully managed in public statements while being reported accurately in classified briefings to Hitler and the military high command. The accounting of structural destruction emerged gradually over the following week as assessment teams completed their surveys. 13,010 buildings destroyed completely, meaning demolished to foundations or burned to walls only. 6,360 buildings seriously damaged, meaning structurally unsound and requiring demolition or major reconstruction. 9,217 buildings moderately damaged, meaning repairable but currently uninhabitable. The total, 28,587 buildings damaged or destroyed, represented approximately 30% of Cologne's total building stock. Certain districts had effectively ceased to exist. The Altstadt Nord medieval quarter was 92% destroyed. The industrial districts of Cologne-Deutz were 68% destroyed. The residential neighbourhoods west of the Cathedral were 74% destroyed. The damage pattern showed both the effectiveness and limitations of area bombing. Where incendiaries had concentrated and started firestorms, destruction was near total. Where bombs had scattered more widely, damage was severe but not complete. The infrastructure damage threatened Cologne's viability as a functioning city. 469 kilometres of water mains destroyed, meaning 2/3 of the city lacked running water. 57 kilometres of gas mains ruptured, creating explosion and fire hazards that required emergency crews to shut down entire districts. 112 kilometres of electrical cables destroyed, meaning power outages affecting 400,000 people. The transportation infrastructure survived, better than housing. All Rhine bridges remained intact, though approach roads were damaged. The main railway station suffered damage, but remained partially operational. The Hohenzollern Bridge, though targeted multiple times, survived with minor damage. The Rhine itself could not be destroyed, and the river's role as transportation artery meant Cologne retained some connection to the broader German economy, despite the devastation of its internal infrastructure. The industrial damage assessment proved more complex than simple building counts suggested. The Ford Workey automobile plant was 80% destroyed, its assembly buildings burned, its machinery exposed to the elements, its windows shattered by blast waves. But inspecting engineers discovered that much of the machine tooling survived intact beneath rubble and could be recovered and relocated. The Humboldt-Deutz engine factory suffered similar damage pattern, buildings destroyed but recoverable equipment. 17 other major factories sustained serious damage. But only 4 were damaged beyond any reasonable repair timeline. The fundamental lesson for German industrial planners was that concentrated factories were vulnerable to area bombing, but that dispersed, hidden, or hardened facilities could survive. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, received reports on Cologne's industrial damage and began planning the dispersal strategy that would define German war production for the remainder of the war, moving factories into tunnels, forests, and small towns where they couldn't be easily found or destroyed by mass bombing. The homeless census, conducted over the first week of June, counted 45,132 people who had lost their housing during the raid. The actual number was certainly higher, perhaps by 10 or 20,000, as many homeless simply left Cologne for other cities without registering with authorities. The Nazi welfare organisation, the NSV, established emergency housing in schools, churches, and requisitioned buildings, providing temporary shelter that was crowded and unsanitary, but preferable to sleeping in rubble. Trains evacuated thousands of homeless to cities across Germany, dispersing Cologne's population and reducing the concentration that made the city such an attractive target. The evacuation was officially voluntary but effectively mandatory for those without resources to secure independent housing. Cologne's population, 768,000 before the raid, would decline to approximately 600,000 by the end of June, and continue declining with subsequent raids until by 1945. Fewer than 40,000 people remained in what had been Germany's fourth largest city. The dawn of May 31st revealed to Cologne's residents and to the world that strategic bombing had crossed a threshold from harassment to genuine destruction. The previous raids had been damaging but manageable local emergencies that the city absorbed and recovered from. This raid was different in scale and effect, a demonstration that concentrated bombing could devastate a city in a single night, overwhelming defences and civil services through sheer volume of explosives delivered in compressed time. The city at dawn was not the city that had existed at dusk. In 90 minutes, Cologne had been transformed from a functioning metropolis into a landscape of ruins, smoke, and homeless civilians. The transformation was not complete. The city still existed, but it existed now as a place fundamentally damaged, its future viability dependent on resources and reconstruction efforts that would compete with the Reich's military priorities. The strategic question, unanswerable on May 31st, but critical to the war's trajectory, was whether this level of destruction would force Germany to divert resources from military operations to civil defence and reconstruction, or whether Germany would accept the damage and continue fighting regardless of the cost to its cities and civilians. The bodies arrived at the temporary morgue established in the parking area of Street Maria Hilf Hospital on June 1st, 1942, carried on improvised stretchers, in wheelbarrows, in blankets, dragged through rubble by exhausted rescue workers. The hospital's actual morgue had capacity for 12 bodies, adequate for normal circumstances, hopelessly inadequate for the aftermath of a 1,000-bomber raid. By noon, 73 bodies lay in rows on the pavement, covered with whatever cloth could be found, awaiting identification and documentation. By evening, the count reached 147. By June 3rd, when the immediate search and rescue operations transitioned to recovery of the dead from collapsed structures, 312 bodies had been documented at this single collection point, one of 7 operating across Cologne. The identification process revealed the bureaucratic nightmare that mass casualty events create in societies dependent on documentation. Some bodies carried identification papers that survived fire and blast. Others could be identified by relatives who came to the morgue searching for missing family members. A grim parade of grief where survivors walked past rows of covered forms hoping not to recognise their loved ones. Many bodies defied identification entirely, burned beyond recognition by firestorms that created temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, or fragmented by high explosive bombs that left remains too damaged for visual identification. The clerk responsible for documentation at Street Maria Hilf Morgue, a man named Friedrich Hoffmann who had worked in Cologne's civil registry for 20 years, struggled to maintain accurate records when faced with remains that consisted of partial bodies, body parts without complete bodies, or ashen fragments that might represent one person or several. His provisional lists included 3 categories: identified dead, unidentified dead, and remains of unknown number of persons. Anna Krohn spent June 2nd at the Missing Persons Bureau, established in a partially damaged school building, searching for information about her neighbours, the Steiner family who had been in their apartment when the raid began. The Bureau had been operating for 36 hours and had already received 2,347 missing person reports, each one representing someone unaccounted for since the raid. The clerks explained that missing didn't necessarily mean dead. Many people had fled Cologne immediately after the raid without informing anyone. Others had been evacuated to hospitals in other cities. Some had sought shelter with relatives in the countryside. The Bureau's task was to cross-reference missing person reports with hospital admission records, refugee registration lists, and casualty reports to determine who was actually dead versus merely displaced. Anna filed her report, received a claim number, and was told to check back in 1 week. The Steiner family would never be found, their names eventually appearing on the presumed dead list, compiled in July. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, received the initial casualty reports in his Berlin office on June 2nd and immediately recognised the political problem they presented. The first report estimated 300 dead, the second report revised upward to 469. The third report classified as preliminary and likely incomplete, suggested actual casualties might exceed 800. Goebbels understood that publishing accurate casualty figures would reveal to the German public the true scale of what had happened to Cologne, would demonstrate that German air defences were inadequate against concentrated British bombing, and would create panic in other cities wondering if they were next. His diary entry for June 2nd captured his thinking. We cannot publish the real figures from Cologne. The effect on morale would be catastrophic. We will acknowledge significant damage, but emphasise reconstruction and revenge. The official death toll published by German authorities on June 4, 1942, listed 469 killed and 5,027 wounded. The figure was not fabricated entirely from nothing. It represented the documented deaths that could be definitively confirmed through identification procedures by June 3rd. But it deliberately excluded categories of casualties that would have raised the total substantially higher. The excluded categories included unidentified remains, assumed to represent one person, but possibly representing multiple persons, missing persons who were almost certainly dead, but whose bodies had not been recovered, transient workers and refugees who had been in Cologne during the raid, but were not on official population rolls, casualties where families had not reported deaths due to evacuation or confusion. Modern historical analysis, working from multiple sources including post-war investigations, German civil defence records, and statistical analysis of missing persons versus later confirmed survivors, estimates actual deaths between 500 and 600, with some researchers arguing the total may have exceeded 800. The discrepancy between official and actual casualties stemmed from multiple factors beyond propaganda manipulation. Accurate casualty counting after urban bombing raids was genuinely difficult, complicated by the destruction of record-keeping infrastructure, the displacement of populations, and the physical reality of high explosive and incendiary effects on human bodies. A person caught in the centre of a high explosive blast might be vaporised, leaving no remains to be counted. A person trapped in a firestorm might be reduced to ash, indistinguishable from the ash of the building that burned around them. A person buried under rubble might not be discovered for weeks or months, long after initial casualty counts were published. The official count of 469 represented the minimum number of deaths that could be proven definitively by June 4th. The actual number was certainly higher, but determining how much higher required investigation that wouldn't occur while the war continued. The demographic pattern of casualties revealed who was most vulnerable during urban bombing raids. Elderly persons were disproportionately represented among the dead, physically unable to reach shelters quickly when sirens sounded or unable to escape from damaged buildings when structures collapsed. Fire wardens and civil defence volunteers were overrepresented, having remained above ground during the raid to fight fires and assist civilians while bombs continued falling. The poorest residents, those living in substandard housing without access to reinforced basement shelters, suffered higher casualty rates than wealthier residents with access to properly constructed shelters. Children under age 5 were surprisingly underrepresented among casualties, protected by parents who prioritised getting them to safety above their own protection. The casualty demographics created a moral complexity that neither side's propaganda acknowledged. Strategic bombing killed disproportionately among those least responsible for the war: the elderly, the poor, the volunteers trying to help others. The mass graves dug in Cologne's Westfriedhof cemetery between June 6th and 8th contained the unidentified dead and partial remains that couldn't be given individual burials. Pastor Wilhelm of Street, Geryon Church documented the burials as best he could, recording names where identification had been possible, listing unknown for remains without identification, and entering remains, number unknown for ashen fragments that might represent one casualty or several. His records showed 117 named individuals buried in mass graves, 43 unknown individuals, and remains representing an unknown number of persons, estimated between 20 and 60. The burials were conducted with minimal ceremony, Protestant and Catholic clergy offering brief prayers over the graves, while civil defence workers stood in respectful silence. The families of the identified deceased were notified when possible, though many families had evacuated Cologne and notification letters were returned undeliverable. The statistical meeting at Cologne Civil Defence Headquarters on June 5th attempted to reconcile 3 different casualty counts that had emerged from different organisations. The fire service reported 315 deaths that occurred in areas where fire crews had operated. The police reported 469 deaths, documented at morgues and casualty collection points. The NSV Welfare Organisation reported 520 missing persons whose families insisted they had been in Cologne during the raid and had not been found alive. The counts overlap partially, but not completely, suggesting that some casualties were being double counted while others were not being counted at all. The meeting concluded that 469 was the minimum confirmed death toll, 500 to 600 was the probable actual death toll, and exceeding 800 was possible if substantial numbers of transients and refugees had been killed without being reported missing. The comparison to British civilian casualties from German bombing provided context for the Cologne death toll's significance. The worst single German raid on a British city had been the Coventry raid of November 14 to 15, 1940, which killed 568 civilians. Cologne exceeded this despite having substantially better air raid shelters and a more developed civil defence infrastructure. The comparison suggested that concentrated bombing could inflict severe casualties regardless of defensive preparations, that the only effective defence against 1,000-bomber raids was not to be targeted in the first place. For German military planners analysing Cologne's experience, the lesson was clear. Either develop air defences capable of preventing such raids, or accept that German cities would suffer casualties in the hundreds to thousands when subjected to concentrated British bombing. Neither option was achievable in the near term, meaning German cities would simply endure the casualties as part of the price of continuing the war. The casualty count controversy would continue for decades after the war, with various estimates ranging from the official 469 to over 1,000, depending on which sources were considered reliable and which counting methodologies were used. The uncertainty reflected both the genuine difficulty of casualty accounting after mass bombing and the propaganda incentives that encouraged both sides to manipulate numbers. Germany had incentive to minimise casualties to avoid admitting the severity of the attack. Britain had incentive to maximise casualties to demonstrate the bombing campaign's effectiveness. The actual number, somewhere in between, would never be known with certainty because the records that would allow definitive accounting were destroyed in the same raids that created the casualties. The residents of Cologne who died on May 31st, 1942, left behind grieving families, empty places at tables, and statistical uncertainty about how many of them there actually were. The operations room at RAF Marham fell silent at 0300 hours on June 1st as the final aircraft landed, and the duty officer marked the status board with grim finality. 8 Wellingtons missing, presumed lost. The squadron had dispatched 19 aircraft to Cologne 5 hours earlier. 11 had returned, their crews exhausted and shaken by what they had witnessed. 8 had not returned, and as dawn approached with no further radio contact, the missing aircraft transitioned from overdue to failed to return, the bureaucratic phrase that meant 56 men were dead or captured. The squadron commander, Wing Commander Peterson, began the process of writing letters to 56 families, letters that would begin with, "I regret to inform you," and would attempt to offer comfort in the face of loss that admitted no comfort. The telegram arrived at Dorothy Mallander's home in Sheffield on June 2nd, delivered by a boy on a bicycle who knew from the envelope's appearance what news it contained, and who tried to hand it over quickly and leave before the grief began. Mrs. Mallander signed for the telegram, tipped the boy sixpence, and closed the door before opening the envelope with hands that trembled despite her effort to remain steady. The text was brief and bureaucratic. "Regret to inform you that your son, Pilot Officer Peter Mallander, is reported missing on air operations on the night of May 30 to 31st. Letter follows. Any further information will be immediately communicated to you." The word missing offered fragile hope. Missing meant possibly alive, possibly captured, possibly returning. But Mrs. Mallander had read enough war news to understand that missing on air operations usually meant dead. The body lost in the wreckage of an aircraft that had burned or crashed into the sea. The missing aircraft inquiry conducted by RAF Intelligence attempted to determine the fate of each aircraft that failed to return, cross-referencing multiple sources to construct probable loss scenarios. German radio intercepts provided information about some losses, broadcasts announcing that specific British bombers had been shot down at specific locations and times. Crash site reports from German authorities revealed others locations where aircraft had impacted and been identified by serial numbers on wreckage. Prisoner of war reports from the International Red Cross identified crew members who had survived and been captured. The process took weeks, gradually filling in details about what had happened to the 40 aircraft that hadn't returned from Cologne. 22 had been destroyed by flak, their wreckage scattered across Western Germany and the occupied Netherlands. 12 had been shot down by night fighters, confirmed through German pilot reports and wreckage recovery. 4 had been lost to mid-air collisions, witnessed by other crews who reported seeing aircraft collide and fall burning. 2 had crashed in England during attempted emergency landings, their crews surviving in one case, dying in the other. The statistical revelation that emerged from loss analysis was both damning and predictable. Training unit crews suffered disproportionate casualties compared to operational squadron crews. Of the 40 aircraft lost, 26 came from training units, representing 7.1% of the 367 training unit aircraft dispatched. Only 14 losses came from the 602 operational unit aircraft, representing 2.8% loss rate. The disparity reflected experience levels, veteran crews having developed survival skills that partially trained crews lacked. Experienced pilots knew when to take evasive action and when to hold steady. Experienced navigators maintained better situational awareness, knowing where they were and what defences they were approaching. Experienced gunners identified night fighters earlier and called evasive manoeuvres before the fighters achieved firing position. Training unit crews, some with pilots on their first operational mission, lacked these learned skills and paid the price in substantially higher loss rates. The casualty accounting from the 40 lost aircraft totaled 254 aircrew killed, 144 captured, and 72 wounded but surviving. The killed included complete crews who died when their aircraft exploded or crashed with such force that no one could survive. The captured included crews who successfully bailed out over enemy territory and were captured within hours by German forces. The wounded included men who survived crashes with injuries ranging from broken bones to severe burns. Some of the wounded would recover and eventually return to operations. Others would be medically discharged, their flying careers ended by injuries sustained over Cologne. The youngest fatality was 19 years old, a sergeant pilot from a training unit flying his second operation. The oldest was 42, an instructor with over 3,000 flight hours who had been recalled from training duties for Operation Millennium. The aircraft type analysis showed the Lancaster's superiority in survivability compared to older types. Only 2 Lancasters were lost from 73 dispatched, a 2.7% loss rate. Halifax's lost 5 from 131 dispatched, 3.8%. Stirling's lost 7 from 88 dispatched, 8%. But the obsolete types suffered catastrophically. Hampden's lost 4 from 79 dispatched, 5.1%. Manchester's lost 4 from 46 dispatched, 8.7%. The Wellingtons, forming the backbone of the force with 338 dispatched, lost 20 aircraft, 5.9%. The analysis suggested that as Bomber Command transitioned to 4-engine heavy bombers and retired the obsolete twin-engine types, loss rates would decrease. But the transition would take months, and in the meantime, crews would continue flying aircraft that were demonstrably more vulnerable to German defences. The training impact became apparent within weeks as Bomber Command's expansion plans collided with the reality of depleted training capacity. RAF Dischforth, a bomber training station that had contributed 12 aircraft and 60 instructor pilots to Operation Millennium, lost 3 aircraft and 21 instructors. The station was effectively unable to conduct training for 6 weeks, while replacement instructors were recruited and trained, creating a gap in the training pipeline that delayed dozens of student crews from completing their courses. Bomber Command's planned expansion assumed a steady flow of 200 newly qualified crews per month from training schools. The actual flow for July and August of 1942 dropped to 140 crews per month due to instructor shortages and aircraft shortages at training units that had contributed their resources to Operation Millennium. The notification letters that reached families across Britain through June and July followed a standard format, but couldn't standardise grief. Squadron commanders wrote personal paragraphs, acknowledging the individual contributions of lost airmen, mentioning their skill, their dedication, their sacrifice for a cause larger than themselves. The letters were sincerely meant but necessarily similar, because ultimately there was little individual to say about men who had died doing the same thing in the same place for the same reason. The official casualty notification telegram would arrive first, delivering the blow. The squadron commander's letter would arrive days or weeks later, providing context and closure, but changing nothing about the fundamental fact of loss. Some families would later receive personal effects, the contents of footlockers and personal items that had been in crew quarters when the men departed for Cologne and never returned. These items, photographs and letters and books and small treasures, became the tangible remnants of lives ended at 20 or 22 or 25 years old. Peter Mallander's body was never recovered. His Lancaster had been shot down by a night fighter over Belgium during the return flight, witnessed by crews from other aircraft who saw the fighter attack, saw the Lancaster catch fire, saw it spiral down, burning with no parachutes emerging. The aircraft crashed in a wooded area near Liège, the impact scattering wreckage across a quarter-mile radius. German recovery teams found the crash site 3 days later and recovered partial remains of the crew, but identification was impossible. The 7 men who had crewed Mallander's Lancaster were eventually listed as killed in action, remains not recovered, and their names were inscribed on the Runnymede Memorial commemorating airmen with no known graves, Mrs. Mallander received her son's last letter, the one he had written before the mission, and a small box containing his personal effects, including the photographs he had kept in his footlocker. The photograph of his crew, 7 young men standing in front of their Lancaster, would occupy a place of honour in her home for the remaining 43 years of her life. The strategic question that emerged from the loss analysis was whether Operation Millennium's results justified sacrificing 40 aircraft and 398 casualties. Harris and the air staff argued yes, pointing to the unprecedented damage inflicted on Cologne and the demonstration that 1,000 bomber raids were operationally feasible. Critics within other services argued no, pointing out that 40 bombers represented approximately 10% of Bomber Command's operational strength at the time, and that losing 10% of available forces on a single raid was unsustainable if repeated regularly. The debate was fundamentally unresolvable because it depended on assumptions about strategic bombing's ultimate effectiveness that wouldn't be testable until after the war. What was certain was that 40 aircraft and nearly 400 men had been expended on the night of May 30 to 31st, and that this cost would have to be factored into planning for future operations. The 1,000 bomber raid could be repeated, but not frequently, and not without accepting casualty levels that would challenge even Harris's considerable ruthlessness. The photo interpreters at RAF Medmenham worked through June 8, 1942, examining reconnaissance photographs of Cologne with magnifying glasses and calibrated measuring tools, counting destroyed buildings and assessing damage to industrial targets. The photographs, taken from 28,000 feet by reconnaissance, Spitfires that overflew Cologne in the days following the raid, showed the city in remarkable detail despite smoke that still obscured some districts. The analysts worked methodically, marking each destroyed building on overlay maps, distinguishing between buildings completely destroyed, seriously damaged, and moderately damaged. By late afternoon, the preliminary assessment was complete. 13,000 buildings destroyed or seriously damaged, visible fire damage across approximately 600 acres of the city, heavy damage to 17 major industrial facilities, including the Ford Work plant. The assessment was forwarded to Air Ministry with a cover note. Damage assessment Cologne exceeds all previous raids on German cities by order of magnitude. The Ford Worky plant assessment revealed both the immediate impact of area bombing and its limitations regarding long-term strategic effectiveness. Aerial photographs showed 80% of the plant's assembly buildings destroyed, roofs collapsed, walls blown out, production equipment exposed to the elements. Ground-level intelligence from resistant sources confirmed that production had ceased completely on June 1st, that thousands of workers had been evacuated from Cologne, that the plant's management estimated 6 months minimum before production could resume. But engineers, inspecting the wreckage, discovered that most of the machine tools, the critical capital equipment that represented years of investment and manufacturing capacity, had survived the bombing intact. The tools were buried under rubble, damaged by fire, requiring cleaning and recalibration, but fundamentally functional. German recovery teams could, and would, extract this equipment and relocate it to dispersed facilities where it would resume producing military vehicles by December of 1942. Winston Churchill and Arthur Harris met at the Prime Minister's office on June 10th to review Operation Millennium's results and discuss implications for future bombing strategy. Churchill opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "Well, Harris, You've proven you can assemble 1,000 bombers and devastate a city. The question now is whether we can sustain this tempo and whether it produces results worth the cost. Harris presented the damage assessment, emphasizing the unprecedented scale of destruction, the overwhelming of Cologne's defences, the demonstration that concentrated bombing could devastate German cities. But Churchill pressed on the sustainability question, pointing out that Bomber Command couldn't conduct 1,000-bomber raids weekly without crippling its training infrastructure and accepting unsustainable loss rates. Harris conceded the point but argued that the demonstration itself had value, proving to Stalin that Britain was seriously attacking Germany, proving to the Americans that strategic bombing worked, proving to the German civilian population that they were not safe from the war their government had started. The German response assessment, compiled by British intelligence from multiple sources including decrypted signals and resistance reports, revealed that Operation Millennium had triggered exactly the strategic reaction that Harris had hoped for. Albert Speer, the Reich Armaments Minister, received detailed reports on Cologne's damage and immediately began planning the industrial dispersal strategy that would define German war production for the remainder of the conflict. Speer's directive, issued in June of 1942, ordered the relocation of critical war industries away from cities to tunnels, underground facilities, and small dispersed workshops in forests and rural areas where they would be difficult to locate and impossible to destroy through area bombing. The directive represented strategic success for British bombing policy, forcing Germany to divert resources from military production to defensive measures and dispersal efforts. But it also represented a challenge because dispersed industry was harder to bomb effectively than concentrated industry in known cities. The cost-benefit analysis attempted by Air Ministry economists produced numbers that could be interpreted to support any predetermined conclusion. The 40 lost bombers represented approximately £3.2 million in lost aircraft, calculated at £80,000 per bomber average across all types. The casualties represented the loss of 400 trained aircrew whose training had cost approximately £15,000 per man, totaling £6 million in training investment lost. Total cost of the raid, approximately £9.2 million, not including bomb expenditure, fuel, and operational costs. Damage inflicted, estimated from reconnaissance assessment and pre-raid valuation of Cologne's industrial infrastructure. £78 million according to optimistic calculations that assumed complete destruction of everything hit. But economic analysts noted that the 78 million figure assumed permanent destruction, when in reality much of the damaged infrastructure would be repaired or replaced within months. Actual lasting economic damage was estimated at £15 to £20 million, still a significant return on £9.2 million invested, but less impressive than the initial assessment suggested. The production impact analysis revealed the temporary nature of bombing's economic effect on German war production. Cologne's industrial output in June of 1942 dropped 23% compared to May, a significant reduction that supported claims of bombing effectiveness. But by September, Cologne's industrial output had recovered to 89% of pre-raid levels, despite the city still showing massive visible destruction. The recovery occurred through multiple mechanisms: clearing debris from factories and resuming production in partially damaged facilities, relocating critical equipment to undamaged workshops, substituting production from other cities for what Cologne could no longer produce, and recruiting replacement workers to replace those killed or evacuated. The German war economy demonstrated resilience that British planners had not anticipated, an ability to absorb damage and reconstitute production faster than bombing could permanently destroy it. The strategic question that emerged from the analysis was whether 26 raids of 40 bombers each, distributed across different cities and different nights, would have been more effective than one raid of 1,000 bombers against Cologne. The distributed approach would have spread damage across more targets, would have forced Germany to defend more cities simultaneously, would have avoided the training disruption that Operation Millennium created. But the distributed approach would have lacked the psychological impact, wouldn't have proven the feasibility of concentrated bombing, wouldn't have generated the propaganda value that justified Bomber Command's continued independence. Harris's position was that both approaches had value, that Bomber Command should conduct occasional maximum effort raids for demonstration purposes while maintaining steady pressure through smaller raids. The position was operationally sound but politically motivated, shaped by Harris's need to defend strategic bombing against skeptics who argued that the resources could be better employed supporting other operations. The defensive lessons learned by Germany would shape the air war for its remaining 3 years. Cologne demonstrated that concentrated anti-aircraft fire couldn't stop 1,000-bomber raids, that searchlights were overwhelmed by bomber stream density, that night fighters achieved some success but couldn't prevent the attack. The solutions Germany developed in response included massive expansion of flak production, deploying thousands of additional anti-aircraft guns to cities across the Reich, development of improved night fighter tactics and equipment, including radar-equipped fighters and wild-boar freelance tactics, acceleration of civil defence infrastructure, building massive bunker complexes in major cities to protect civilians, and industrial dispersal to reduce vulnerability to area bombing. Each of these responses consumed German resources that would otherwise have been available for military operations, validating the strategic bombing theory that attacking the homeland would force resource diversion even if it didn't destroy production capacity directly. The comparison to future raids revealed Cologne's role as template rather than pinnacle. Operation Millennium was not the most destructive raid of the war. It would be dwarfed by Hamburg in July of 1943, where Operation Gomorrah killed 42,000 in a firestorm that consumed 8 square miles of the city. It would be exceeded by Dresden in February of 1945, where 2 days of bombing killed approximately 25,000 and destroyed the historic city centre. It would be overshadowed by the American firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945, where 100,000 died in a single night. But Cologne was the first the demonstration that concentrated strategic bombing could devastate cities, the proof of concept that made all subsequent city destruction raids possible. The tactics developed for Cologne, the bomber stream concentration, the use of GEE navigation, the mixture of high explosive and incendiaries, the 90-minute attack window, all these elements became standard practice in subsequent operations. The final assessment, prepared for the War Cabinet in July of 1942, concluded that Operation Millennium had achieved its primary objectives, demonstrating Bomber Command's capability to conduct 1,000-bomber raids, inflicting severe damage on a major German city, proving the bomber stream concept viable, and generating propaganda value that strengthened political support for strategic bombing. But the assessment also acknowledged limitations. The raid had not destroyed Cologne's industrial capacity permanently, had not forced Germany to seek peace, had not validated claims that strategic bombing alone could win the war. The honest conclusion was that Cologne proved strategic bombing could devastate cities, but not that it could win wars. That bombing was a valuable component of Allied strategy, but not a miracle weapon that would eliminate the need for eventual ground invasion. This conclusion satisfied neither bombing enthusiasts who believed air power could achieve total victory, nor bombing skeptics who wanted resources diverted to other services, but it represented the ambiguous reality that Cologne had revealed. The BBC broadcast to Britain and the world at 1300 hours on June 1st, 1942, announced Operation Millennium with carefully calibrated language designed to maximise propaganda value while maintaining credibility. The Royal Air Force last night dispatched over 1,000 bombers to attack the German city of Cologne. Early reports indicate devastating results, with fires visible for over 100 miles and extensive damage to industrial and military targets. The broadcast was technically accurate. 1,000 bombers had been dispatched. Fires were visible from great distance. Extensive damage had occurred. But the language carefully avoided specific claims about casualties or permanent industrial destruction that might later be disproved by reconnaissance. The goal was to shape perception without creating vulnerabilities that German counter-propaganda could exploit. Joseph Goebbels convened his propaganda staff at an emergency meeting on June 2nd to formulate Germany's response to both the raid itself and the British propaganda about the raid. Goebbels understood that suppressing all information about Cologne was impossible. Too many people knew what had happened. Too many soldiers had relatives in Cologne. Too much visible damage existed. The strategy would be controlled acknowledgement, admit that Cologne had been attacked by a large British force, acknowledge significant damage, but emphasise resilience, reconstruction, and German resolve for revenge. The casualty figure of 469 would be published as definitive, despite internal knowledge that actual deaths exceeded this number. The bomber loss figure would be inflated from 40 to 44 to suggest greater German defensive success. The Cathedral's survival would be emphasised as divine providence, protecting German culture against British barbarism. The British newsreel footage, released to cinemas across Britain in the week following the raid, showed carefully edited sequences that supported the narrative of devastating success. Footage of bombers taking off in darkness, their engines roaring, crews waving to cameras before embarking on their mission. Aerial footage of fires over Cologne, captured by cameras in returning bombers, showing the city burning beneath the bomber stream. Reconnaissance photographs showing smoke and destruction, analysed by calm BBC narrators who pointed out destroyed districts and damaged factories. What the footage didn't show was the 40 aircraft that hadn't returned, the 398 casualties, the training units that were depleted by Operation Millennium, the aircraft that had barely made it home with battle damage. The newsreel presented strategic bombing as clinical and effective, minimising the cost while maximising the apparent impact. The German Wochenschau newsreel response, distributed to cinemas across Germany and occupied Europe on June 10th, emphasised resilience and defiance in the face of British terror bombing. Footage showed Cologne residents clearing rubble, civil defence workers fighting fires, Hitler Youth volunteers distributing food to survivors. Gorleiter Grohe appeared on camera declaring Cologne has been tested by the enemy and has not been found wanting. We shall rebuild, we shall continue production, and we shall have our revenge. The footage carefully avoided showing the full extent of destruction, focusing instead on individual examples of survival. A shop reopening despite damage, a factory resuming partial operations, a family returning to a partially damaged apartment. The message was clear. British bombing had failed to break German morale, had strengthened German resolve, had demonstrated British desperation rather than British strength. The neutral reporting from Swedish and Swiss newspapers provided the most accurate contemporary assessments, free from the propaganda constraints that shaped British and German narratives. Swedish press estimates of casualties, based on reports from Swedish nationals evacuated from Cologne, and intelligence from diplomatic sources, suggested 1,000 or more dead, a figure closer to reality than either German or British official claims. Swiss observers noted that Cologne had sustained massive destruction that exceeded anything previously witnessed in the war, but also noted that the city continued functioning, that rail traffic resumed within days, that industries were rebuilding. The neutral assessments recognised both the unprecedented scale of the attack and the resilience of the target, avoiding the triumphalism of British propaganda and the minimisation of German propaganda. The morale impact within Britain energised public opinion in ways that validated Harris's understanding of propaganda value. British civilians enduring rationing and blackouts and the grinding hardship of total war needed evidence that Britain was striking back at Germany effectively. The 1,000-bomber raid provided this evidence in spectacular fashion, demonstrating that the RAF could hit Germany with overwhelming force, that British aircrew were taking the war to German cities, that the sacrifices demanded of British civilians were enabling real damage to the enemy. Public opinion polling, conducted in June of 1942, showed substantial increases in confidence that Britain would win the war, increases that correlated directly with news coverage of the Cologne raid. The propaganda value, measured in morale effect, arguably exceeded the military value measured in destroyed factories. The German civilian reaction proved more complex than Goebbels anticipated, revealing gaps between official propaganda and reality that military censorship couldn't entirely close. Soldiers who had relatives in Cologne received letters describing destruction far worse than official accounts acknowledged, letters that circulated among military units and created skepticism about government statements. Workers evacuated from Cologne and resettled in other cities brought first-hand accounts of the raid's severity, accounts that contradicted official minimisation and raised fears in other cities about what might happen to them. The security service of the SS, which monitored civilian morale, reported in June that the Cologne raid had created noticeable anxiety in other German cities, with residents questioning whether their city might be next and whether German air defences could protect them. Goebbels attempted to counter this anxiety with propaganda, emphasising revenge, promising that Germany would strike back at Britain with new wonder weapons that would dwarf anything the RAF could accomplish. The American reaction to Operation Millennium shaped the emerging debate between British and American bombing doctrines. The United States Army Air Forces advocated daylight precision bombing of specific industrial targets, believing that accurate bombing of critical facilities would be more effective than British night area bombing. The Cologne raid's apparent success in destroying a city created pressure on American planners to demonstrate that precision bombing could achieve better results with less civilian casualties. The pressure would lead to ill-fated American daylight raids later in 1942 that sustained unsustainable losses to German fighters, eventually forcing the Americans to adopt long-range fighter escorts and combined operations with the RAF. But in June of 1942, the American press coverage of Cologne emphasized British effectiveness while maintaining claims that American methods would prove superior. The Soviet reaction to the Cologne raid provided exactly the political benefit Churchill had sought. Stalin had been demanding a second front, an Anglo-American invasion of Western Europe to relieve pressure on Soviet forces fighting Germany in the east. The Cologne raid and Harris's promise of continued large-scale bombing of German cities gave Churchill a response to Stalin's demands. Britain was opening a second front, an aerial front that was diverting German resources to air defense and forcing Germany to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Stalin's response was cautiously positive, acknowledging that strategic bombing contributed to the war effort while continuing to demand ground operations. But the political pressure on Churchill was temporarily relieved, buying time for Britain and America to build the forces necessary for eventual invasion of occupied Europe. The propaganda battle over Cologne continued for months, each side claiming victory and attempting to define the raid's meaning. Britain claimed devastating success, proof that strategic bombing could cripple German war production. Germany claimed resilient survival, proof that British terror bombing could not break German will. The neutral observers recognized elements of truth in both narratives. The raid had inflicted unprecedented damage, and the city had survived and begun rebuilding. The real victor in the battle of narratives was perhaps neither Britain nor Germany, but the institutional momentum of strategic bombing itself. Cologne validated Bomber Command's existence, secured its political support, and guaranteed that the bombing campaign would continue and escalate regardless of actual strategic effectiveness. The raid's propaganda value exceeded its military value, and in total war where morale and political will determined outcomes as much as battlefield victories, propaganda value was a form of military value. Both sides claimed to have won at Cologne. Both were partially right, and both would pay the price for their partial victories in the escalation that Cologne had begun. The operations room at RAF High Wycombe buzzed with planning activity in July of 1942 as Air Marshal Harris's staff prepared 1,000 bomber raids on Essen for June 1st to 2nd and Bremen for June 25th to 26th. The staff worked from the Cologne template, applying lessons learned to new targets, concentrate aircraft into bomber streams, use GEE navigation where possible, mix high explosive and incendiaries to create fires, compress the attack into 90 minutes to overwhelm defences. Both raids launched with great expectations based on Cologne's apparent success. Both failed to achieve comparable results. Essen due to industrial haze that prevented target identification, Bremen due to cloud cover that scattered bombing. But the failures validated the doctrine rather than discrediting it, leading Harris to conclude that what was needed was more raids, better navigation aids to replace GEE when it was jammed, and acceptance that some raids would fail due to weather or other factors. The template persisted even when specific applications failed. Hamburg in July of 1943 demonstrated the full horrific potential of the template refined. Operation Gomorrah employed bomber stream tactics developed at Cologne, added new technology including window radar jamming chaff, and benefited from weather conditions that created perfect firestorm environment. 7 raids over 10 days dropped 9,000 tons of bombs on Hamburg, creating firestorms that killed 42,000 people, 15 times Cologne's casualties. The fires reached temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius, created winds of 150 miles per hour, and consumed 8 square miles of the city in a conflagration that survivors described as hell on earth. Hamburg proved that Cologne's concentrated bombing concept could be refined into something far more destructive, that the template could be iterated toward maximum lethality. The raid also demonstrated strategic bombing's limitations. Hamburg's shipyards resumed production within months, its U-boat construction recovered to previous levels, and Germany's war production overall continued increasing despite the devastation of its second largest city. Dresden in February of 1945 revealed the template's application unmoored from strategic necessity. 773 RAF bombers attacked Dresden over 2 nights, creating firestorms that killed approximately 25,000 people and destroyed the historic city centre. But Dresden in early 1945 held minimal strategic value. Its industries were already isolated from German supply lines by advancing Allied armies, and the city was filled with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance from the east. The raid employed Cologne's tactics, the bomber stream concentration, the mixture of high explosive and incendiaries, the compressed timing, but applied them to a target whose destruction contributed little to Allied victory that was already assured. Dresden demonstrated that the template, once established, could be applied almost automatically, regardless of strategic justification, that the machinery of strategic bombing had acquired its own institutional momentum, independent of rational military planning. The post-war assessment conducted by the British Bombing Survey Unit in 1946 analysed Cologne and the strategic bombing campaign with cold statistical rigour unconstrained by wartime propaganda requirements. The assessment concluded that the Cologne raid had demonstrated technical feasibility of mass attacks but not strategic decisiveness. Cologne's industrial production had been disrupted temporarily but recovered within months. The city's transportation infrastructure had been damaged but not destroyed. The civilian casualties had been severe but had not forced Germany to divert resources from military operations in ways that significantly affected the war's outcome. The broader assessment of strategic bombing's impact concluded that bombing had reduced German production by approximately 13% compared to what it would have been without bombing, a significant but not decisive reduction. The bombing had killed approximately 600,000 German civilians, displaced millions, and destroyed dozens of cities. Whether this cost was justified by the 13% production reduction remained contested among the analysts. Anna Krohn, interviewed in 1975, at age 67, reflected on the night that had ended her previous life and created the harder life that followed. She had rebuilt in Cologne after the war, working in reconstruction efforts that transformed the rubble fields into a modern city that bore little resemblance to the Cologne of her youth. Her children had grown, married, given her grandchildren who knew the war only as history their grandmother had lived through. But the memories remained vivid. The shelter, crowded with terrified neighbours. The explosions that shook the building, emerging at dawn to find her world erased. Cologne died on May 30th, 1942. She said in the interview, "What we rebuilt afterward was something different, something modern and functional, but not the city that had existed for centuries. We lost our history that night, and you can't rebuild history from rubble." Her reflection captured something the statistics and damage assessments missed: the cultural and human cost that couldn't be measured in destroyed buildings or displaced persons. The modern Cologne that emerged from post-war reconstruction bore the scars of May 31st concealed beneath restored facades. The cathedral stood as it had stood for centuries, its damage repaired, its Gothic spires again dominating the skyline. The old town was reconstructed in medieval style, creating the appearance of historical continuity while using modern construction techniques and materials that bore no relationship to authentic medieval building. The Ford plant resumed operations under different ownership, its machine tools recovered from the 1942 rubble and installed in new facilities. The Rhine bridges were rebuilt, carrying more traffic than their predecessors had handled. The population recovered and exceeded its pre-war level. But the Cologne that existed before Operation Millennium, the city that had grown organically over 2,000 years, from Roman settlement through medieval merchant city to modern industrial metropolis, that city was gone forever, replaced by a reconstruction that approximated its appearance while lacking its authentic history. The casualty statistics accumulated across the entire strategic bombing campaign revealed Cologne's role as first chapter in a story of escalating destruction. RAF Bomber Command lost 55,573 aircrew killed during the war, a 44% casualty rate that was the highest of any Allied service. German civilian deaths from strategic bombing totaled approximately 600,000, with millions more displaced than injured. The cities destroyed or severely damaged numbered in the dozens: Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, Cologne, Essen, Dortmund, and scores of smaller cities reduced to rubble by campaigns that employed Cologne's template with ever greater refinement. The tonnage of bombs escalated from the 1,455 tons dropped on Cologne to campaigns that delivered tens of thousands of tons on single cities. The destruction that had shocked the world in June of 1942 became routine by 1944, normalised through repetition until the burning of cities was simply what strategic bombing meant. The moral legacy of Cologne and the strategic bombing campaign it inaugurated remained contested 8 decades later, subject to ongoing historical and ethical debate. The utilitarian defense argued that strategic bombing shortened the war, saved Allied lives that would have been lost in prolonged ground combat, and was justified by the necessity of defeating Nazi Germany. The critics argued that area bombing of cities was indiscriminate killing of civilians, that the military benefits didn't justify the humanitarian cost, and that bombing German cities differed from Nazi atrocities only in being conducted by democracies rather than dictatorships. The debate was unresolvable because it depended on counterfactual assumptions about what would have happened without strategic bombing, assumptions that couldn't be tested. What was certain was that Cologne established the precedent, demonstrated the feasibility, and provided the template for total war against cities that would define the remainder of World War II and would shape fears of future warfare into the nuclear age. The strategic effectiveness question that Operation Millennium was supposed to answer remained ambiguous after thousands of raids and years of bombing. Did strategic bombing change the war? Tactically, yes. The bomber stream tactic worked, GE navigation improved accuracy, concentrated attacks could overwhelm defences. Strategically, the answer was more complex. Bombing forced Germany to divert resources to air defence, destroyed some industrial capacity, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, but didn't prevent German war production from increasing until late 1944, and didn't force German surrender. Was it worth the cost? To RAF leadership, yes. Bombing provided Britain's only offensive capability for much of the war, demonstrated resolve to Allies, and contributed to eventual victory. To the 55,000 aircrew who died, the 600,000 German civilians who died and their families, the question admitted no comfortable answer. The final assessment of Cologne's legacy was perhaps best measured not in destroyed buildings or casualties, but in what the raid made possible and inevitable. Cologne proved that industrial-scale strategic bombing could be organised and executed, that cities could be devastated in single nights, that civilian populations could be targeted with weapons of mass destruction. The raid didn't answer whether this capability should be used, only that it could be. Once the capability existed, once the template was established, once the institutional machinery was created to conduct 1,000 bomber raids, the use of that capability became almost automatic, driven by institutional momentum and the logic of total war. Cologne was the first city to experience industrial-scale strategic bombing, but it was not the last, and could not be the last once the precedent was set. The city that burned on May 31st, 1942, burned as the prototype for a form of warfare that would define the 20th century, and whose moral implications remained unresolved generations later. The Cologne Cathedral at dusk in the 21st century stands illuminated against the modern city, its Gothic spires reaching toward the sky as they have for 7 centuries. Tourists photograph the landmark, unaware or barely aware that the building they admire survived the night that destroyed the city around it. The modern Cologne spreads in all directions, rebuilt and prosperous, home to over 1 million people, Germany's 4th largest city as it was in 1942. The Rhine flows past the city as it has flowed for millennia, indifferent to human construction and human destruction alike. The past exists in archives and memories, and aging survivors, in the reconstructed facades that approximate medieval appearance while concealing modern construction, in the cathedral that stands as witness to both destruction and resilience. On May 30th, 1942, 1,000 British bombers flew to Cologne. They dropped 1,455 tons of bombs in 90 minutes. Approximately 600 people died. 40 aircraft didn't return. In the calculus of total war, both sides called it victory. In the calculus of history, it was the opening chapter of a bombing campaign that would kill hundreds of thousands, devastate countless cities, and leave a moral question that remains unanswered. When does strategic necessity become strategic terror? Cologne didn't answer that question, but it was the first time anyone had to seriously ask,